in addition to the polls that Seth mentioned, and I think that is very good news for labor, is the fact if you look at our public officials, and I've been paying careful attention to their statements over the last several days, from Biden to Trump, the most popular public officials on all sides are standing with and trying to attract labor. And I think the reason is pretty simple. We are talking about record profits for CEOs, and we are talking about workers on the line whose pay has not kept up with inflation. It is not as simple as that when you get to the bargaining table, of course, but that's the message the public is hearing. 40% pay increase for CEOs versus workers whose pay hasn't kept up with inflation. That is a message that is going to resonate with the public, and that means that the polls are supportive of where these workers stand.
Jeannie says it's striking, Rick. That was pretty good, Jeannie. I don't know how you always manage to do it. When's the backlash, though, potentially for these unions? At a certain point, you do reach the level of diminishing returns here. People's shows aren't on this fall. Maybe you can't get a car the way you want, or your car's price goes higher because of this. And maybe the cumulative effect leads to a recession. Does that blow back on the union ever?
You know, I think the cover over all of this is the politics of this, right? You got to remember that it were the union voters who helped put Donald Trump up and become president in 2016 in some of these key Midwestern states. And so they've been looking at options to being, loyal to the Democratic Party. And I think what you see here is the potential for this strike and the emergence of time with this strike. In other words, the longer it takes, the worse it is for Joe Biden. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. And potentially the better it is for Donald Trump. I mean, so Biden's efforts to try and promote unions in America may result in benefits to Donald Trump.
A lot more to come with our panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano out of the blocks on a Monday with an apparent deal in the House on the budget among Republicans. Can it last beyond the end of this program? We'll talk to Rick and Jeannie and have more from Capitol Hill next. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. This is Bloomberg.
news, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with an update out of Amazon and Microsoft. Amazon.com is hiring Microsoft's product chief to run the division responsible for Alexa and the Echo smart speakers. This according to people familiar with the situation. Those sources say Panos Panay, who led Microsoft's Windows team and was central to the company's hardware push with its Surface computers, said today that he is leaving Microsoft. Amazon, by the way, will be holding its annual New Devices event on Wednesday. We've got stocks higher across the board, off session highs right now. Apple among the gainers, up 2.3%. Analysts are considering pre-orders for the company's latest iPhone, and the firms are noting a preference for more expensive models. Again, Apple shares, they are advancing now. We've got Apple by about 2.3%. Stocks higher, S&P up 11, up by about 0.3%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 78 now. That is a gain of 0.2%. NASDAQ up 28, up 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.31% with a 2-year 5.05%. Spot gold up $8 the ounce to $19.32, up by about 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.2%, 90.95 for a barrel of WTI. Brent, the global benchmark, now unchanged at 94.93 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
As the UAW auto workers strike enters day 4 today, there's talk of a deal here in Washington on funding the government. This is not a story that's going away anytime soon, certainly not before the end of the month when the fiscal year ends. The big question right now is, does the government shut down at the end of this month, or will there be a continuing resolution, a stopgap bill that somehow gets us through the end of the month and buys a little more time to negotiate here? By the way, everyone seems to think a shutdown will still be inevitable just later on in the year. But how about this headline? And great work from Billy House and Eric Wasson, Bloomberg Congress reporters. McCarthy demands 8% spending cut, border wall to avert shutdown. Hey, we've got a deal on something? You know, of course, members of the Freedom Caucus have not been big fans of Speaker McCarthy, leading to this government fight. Interesting headline as well on the terminal as we seek to apparently relitigate the debt ceiling deal. Now, this was playing out on Sunday morning television before we bring Rick and Jeannie back in here. Kevin McCarthy on Fox talking to Maria Bartiromo about landing a deal here and avoiding a shutdown for political reasons.
A shutdown would only give strength to the Democrats. It would give the power to Biden. It wouldn't pay our troops. It wouldn't pay our border agents. More people would be coming across. I actually want to achieve something.
Right around that same time, Fox News Sunday, Elise Stefanik, of course, whipping for Republicans in the leadership in the U.S. House.
Well, we're in a very good place. I've been engaged in conversation with members as well as Speaker McCarthy over the weekend. We are working through this, and I'm optimistic that we will continue to move the appropriations process forward. And that includes the DOD appropriations bill. That also includes potentially a continuing resolution to ensure that we do not face a government shutdown.
Government funding fight, just round 2 of the debt ceiling brawl, I read on the terminal. And that is basically what we're talking about here, right? We thought this was largely done earlier in the year when we avoided default, but we're doing this again. Let's reassemble the panel with Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. What's your thought on the appropriations process this morning here, Rick? I see that 98 members of the House Democrats, the new Democrat coalition, this according to Axios, off with a letter to Kevin McCarthy urging him to put the Senate's bipartisan appropriations bill up for a vote. Does it sound like consensus around anything right now on Capitol Hill?
Well, I think we can ignore the Democrats right now. They're probably just taking advantage politically. Their ability to affect change right now is pretty limited. I think what you're hoping for is that the Republican caucus actually gets together. If you could get 90 Republicans in a room who would actually agree on a way forward on this thing, it'd be a significant accomplishment. And I think what we heard over the weekend, you know, with the Freedom Caucus and the Main Street Caucus, two diametrically opposite groups, right? One tends toward more centrist policies, the other tends toward more off the cliff policies. And they got together and said, look, let's put a little mini bus together, a group of agencies that we can fund. They did the 8% cut that you described, non-defense spending, and said we as a group would be willing to support this. The problem is there are three other caucuses within the Republican Party. The five families, remember, we're reminded of them all the time we get into this kind of trouble. Well, they haven't been heard of yet. So I was really happy to hear the speaker, as you played the clip over the weekend, say, I want to avoid a shutdown, because some in his caucus think a shutdown's good politics. He is smart enough still as a politician to know that that's only going to give more power to the Democrats and make Republicans look like they can't manage the federal budget. So there seems to be new pressure, new momentum in trying to avert a shutdown. And I think it's pick 'em, right? You know, you can take the Senate bill, you can pass the House bill, but either way, it gets then into a good conversation about putting a spending package together that keeps you from having to shut down the government.
Jeannie, Elise Stefanik says Republicans in the House are in a good place. Rick just mentioned the Main Street Caucus, the House Freedom Caucus, coming together to essentially endorse this deal that Kevin McCarthy is promoting. He says they're going to vote on this on Thursday, but it wasn't the Main Street Caucus we had to worry about originally, right? Can the House Freedom Caucus stay together on this?
You know, apparently not. I mean, just in the hours after they released this, you had 10 members come forward and say they weren't going to support it, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's not a part of the Freedom Caucus. She's part of McCarthy's leadership. I don't know what Elise Stefanik is thinking when she describes this as a good position for the House Republican leadership. It is
hopeful.
Anything but. She's very optimistic, apparently. God bless her. She's also a New Yorker. But the reality is, what they are talking about is DOA. It is dead on arrival in the Senate, and they are going to waste all this time, all this energy. I don't know, best case scenario, they hold these various families, as Rick describes them, together. They pass this thing. It is dead on arrival in the Senate. It will not get the signature of the president, even if it passed. And let's not forget, if you are serious about curtailing spending, if you are serious about the deficit and debt we have overspent in recent years, this is a nightmare, because it is not going to help the situation. But the reality is most of these people in the Freedom Caucus are not serious about this. This is performative, because if they were serious, they would be thinking about things and they would be working with people who also have power in Congress to move this through in a productive way. So yeah, Elise Stefanik, very optimistic this weekend, but I'm not sure why.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, Ron DeSantis, not terribly optimistic. He's backing those members of the Freedom Caucus who say, go ahead and shut it down. And Kevin McCarthy was asked about that as well in his interview on Fox. Rick, here's what he said.
Look, I served with Ron DeSantis. He's not at the same level as President Trump by any shape or form. He would not have gotten elected without President Trump's endorsement. And so I believe our best step forward, pass our appropriation bills so we're stronger.
With a swipe at Ron DeSantis on the campaign trail as well. Should the governor of Florida wade into this, Rick, or does he end up with egg on his face?
Yeah, no, I don't get it. I mean, the one thing about running for president, if you're in Congress, is it means you don't have to weigh into this stuff. You would think a governor would be smart enough not to get into the middle of this morass, and especially because you have no idea how it's going to turn out. And so, yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, like, I've advised a lot of candidates who ran for national office, and I didn't ever have one single moment where I said, hey, it's a good thing to jump into this, internecine political warfare in Washington, because somehow that's going to mean more to your primary voters. Nah, he's wrong about this. He's only going to spend more of his political capital on something that isn't worth anything.
That's pretty tough stuff there. He's looking for any opportunity to break out, though, Jeannie. In the latest polls that we saw over the weekend, there was another one from CBS, show Ron DeSantis in some polls back in single digits here. I don't want to open a whole new front on the campaign trail, but specific to his candidacy, weighing in on the Tuberville blockade in support, weighing in on the Freedom Caucus support of a government shutdown. Is this his final stand?
You know, it very well might be, because also over the weekend, you had Donald Trump out on Meet the Press with Kristen Welker. Congratulations to Kristen Welker, another woman leading a Sunday show. And what was he doing? He was talking like he is already the candidate for the Republicans. He's pivoting to the general. So, you know, it may be a last stand for Ron DeSantis. And ouch, the swipe that McCarthy took. I've served with him and he's not up to par. I mean, you know, it was ugly all around for Ron DeSantis this weekend. Not something he should have weighed in on, and, you know, just getting hit down by the House Speaker.
Got less than a minute, Rick. Will Kevin McCarthy then be the undoing of the DeSantis campaign?
No, I think the DeSantis campaign is being undone by DeSantis himself. Nobody can take that award away from him.
Well, that's saying something. There it is, from a master in campaigning. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, we thank you. As we turn to news next about this prisoner swap with Iran. This is highly controversial, but one that coincides with President Biden's arrival at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and of course precedes a speech not only from President Biden, but of course the leader of Iran at that event as well. We're going to talk about that straight ahead with Rick and Jeannie after we bring you up to date on world and national news. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hey, Nancy.
Joe, continuing on that theme, 5 Americans who were detained in Iran are on their way home. And as part of that deal, the U.S. is giving Tehran access to $6 billion of its own oil revenue that the U.S. had frozen through sanctions. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby is defending the arrangement, stressing there will be rigid restrictions on Iran's ability to use that money. He spoke with CNN.
They can request a withdrawal for humanitarian goods, agricultural products, medical supplies, food. And then we will run a process through which those goods are contracted for. The Iranians don't even get to let the contracts. We'll make sure that the contracts are let with vendors that we know we can trust. And then that material will be delivered to the Iranian people. The Iranian regime does not get hands on this money.
National Security Council spokesman John Kirby speaking with CNN about that prisoner swap. The U.S. military is looking for an F-35 fighter jet that's gone missing in South Carolina. Joint Base Charleston is saying a mishap forced the pilot to eject from the advanced stealth aircraft yesterday. We asked Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern how the Air Force could lose one of its most highly advanced weapon systems.
I've been looking to see what the command center is saying. The pilot was able to evacuate, but still this F-35 seems to be missing.
While we wait for answers, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reports Joint Base Charleston is working with the local Marine Air Station to search for the plane near North Charleston, which is based on its last known location. Hunter Biden is suing the IRS. The son of President Biden alleges IRS agents illegally disclosed his tax return information. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in Washington, and the allegations center on disclosures made by 2 IRS agents during TV interviews and testimony before Congress. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Yeah, it's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Wall Street hits the hold button in the run-up to the Federal Reserve decision on Wednesday. S&P right now up by just about 0.3%, up 12 points at 44.62. The Dow up 80. That is a gain of 0.2%. And NASDAQ is up 31, higher by 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.31% with the 2-year 5.05%. Spot gold up $8 the ounce to $19.32. That is a gain of 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.4%, 91.12 on WTI. We've got Brent at 94.10 now. That is a gain of 0.2%. Brent crude trading around $94 a barrel, highlighting inflationary pressures just as policymakers prepare for interest rate decisions. So what about the economic impact, especially if crude does go to $100 a barrel? That would be Brent crude. Chevron CEO Mike Wirth was asked that question this morning on Bloomberg Markets.
Well, certainly those are higher prices than we tend to see out over the long term, and so I think it will have some effect on the economy. But we've had relatively higher oil prices here now for most of this year and certainly all of last year. The recession that everyone's been talking about hasn't arrived, and so I think the underlying drivers of the economy in the U.S. and frankly globally remain pretty healthy.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. A mixed day for a lot of the energy names. Chevron up by 0.4%. ExxonMobil up 0.7%. ADRs of BP, they're down 0.5%. EOG Resources down 0.4%. Pioneer Natural up by 0.2%. Again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 11, up 0.3%. 10-year yield 4.31%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
Important news as President Biden begins his visit to the United Nations General Assembly this week in New York. The news is not from New York, but overseas. 5 Americans freed in Iran prisoner swap land in Qatar, the headline on the terminal. A remarkable moment, whether you agree with this or not. Imagine their thoughts as these 5 Americans walked onto the ramp in 104 degrees Fahrenheit late Monday in Doha. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke a short time later.
Just a few minutes ago, I had the great pleasure of speaking to 7 Americans who are now free from their imprisonment or detention in Iran, out of prison, and now in Doha, en route back to the United States to be reunited with their loved ones. 5 of the 7, of course, had been unjustly detained, imprisoned in Iran, some for years. 2 others had been prevented from leaving Iran.
You're seeing that shot of the tarmac. If you're with us watching today on YouTube, you can do that always now on Bloomberg Sound On. Get to YouTube, search Bloomberg Global News, and join us here in studio. Now, as part of the swap, the administration here is releasing 5 Iranians held in U.S. custody. The most controversial element, though, is the money here. You've heard about this likely by now. $6 billion in oil revenue that had been frozen in South Korean banks due to sanctions, now unlocked. Let's reassemble our panel for their take on this. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, was this all worth it?
You know, you look at these people and they've suffered in one of the most notorious prisons in Iran for many, many years in some cases, Evin prison. And, you know, your heart goes out to them. You're so happy for their families. They seem to be in good health. That is all a very positive thing. But I think the concerns on the flip side are very real from a policy perspective. The United States has had this challenge with Iran since its inception. In 1979, we have had many exchanges before, but let's be very clear. And I think one very small thing the administration could do is change its language. This is not a prisoner swap. The Americans held were given sham trials. They were not prisoners. The people held here that are being released, the Iranians, they were given a fair trial. So it is, not as if it is a prisoner swap. The Americans were held excuse me, unjustly. And so that is one very small thing. But I do think the concerns are very real about the use of this $6 billion. Iran has been very clear they won't just restrict it to humanitarian reasons. And I am a firm believer that we have to have a set out policy on that. And we have not, as it pertains to these activities that have been going on long before Biden came into office.
Rick, I want to read you a statement from Senator Ted Cruz, of course, serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Quote, President Biden has established a secret nuclear deal with the Iranian regime, he writes, that is being kept from Congress and the American people. Today's news, he says, confirms there has already been a side deal, including a $6 billion ransom and the release of Iranian operatives. Is he right?
We have no idea if what Ted Cruz says is true or not. There's no evidence that there is a deal. And if there were a deal, why wouldn't it be public? I doubt if anybody in the White House could think that they could keep a Iranian nuclear deal secret, especially through an election year. So I discount that. But I think he is right to question the use of frozen Iranian funds to pay for the release. We all celebrate the release of these individuals. One, Mr. Namazi, had been in a horrible prison for almost 3,000 days. I mean, that's outrageous. And the conduct of the Iranian regime is to blame, nobody else. And so it's a good thing that they're coming home, and it's a good thing that they're being greeted with a fanfare by Americans, because we can't allow the Iranians to dictate fairness. And that being said, Iran has turned hostage taking into a commercial enterprise, and we have to find ways as a government to not fall prey to that. Right now, if you're an American in Iran, you're a high value hostage, because they know that they can get something from our administration for it. And that's Republicans and Democrats alike. Nobody wants hostages to remain in that godforsaken place. So we need a new policy. We need something that we can adhere to, and thank God they're back, but it gives us time now to really think through how to approach this regime in the future.
Well, let's talk here, Jeannie, that this move paves the way for talks over Iran's nuclear program. Is that the end goal, or was this just a matter of getting people home?
Yeah, I mean, the administration has denied any connection between the two, but there is, to your point, a lot of speculation that in reality there is a tie. I think talks would be a very good thing, and any communication on Iran's nuclear capacity would be a good thing. But, I don't think we know the veracity of whether, in fact, that's the case. I do go back to the fact we do need a policy. I was just talking to somebody about James Foley, and you remember this story well. We don't negotiate with terrorists. And yet in the case of Russia, who the president describes as a terrorist government in many respects, and Iran, we do negotiate. And so to the families of these hostages, and they are hostages, the question is, when do we and when don't we as a government negotiate? We have no clarity on that from the U.S. government. And again, this precedes Joe Biden by many, many years, if not decades. We do need to come to some kind of policy agreement and consensus on that. We don't want to risk that we incentivize the capture of Americans traveling. And as one of this Republican senators said over the weekend, people need to be very careful about traveling to Iran at this point. It is a very dangerous situation.
Now, we've just learned the president held what's being described as an emotional call with the families of the American citizens returning home to the U.S. from Iran. And while we can talk about the controversy here, and we will continue to, certainly depending on how this plays out, I think what Rick said is important, and that's obviously all of us are relieved to see these folks get home. Antony Blinken referring earlier to the emotional conversation that he had with them as well, and what must be going through their minds. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with analysis from Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. This is Sound On. We do this every day from Washington, the fastest show in politics. We're going to tackle decorum in the Senate coming up. More specifically, the dress code in the Senate, which is not getting more strict. We'll talk about it with Rick and Jeannie ahead. I'm Joe Matthew, and this is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Nikola shares are now surging 31% after the company appointed former GM president Mary Chan as its new chief operating officer. The hire comes a month after Nikola chairman Steve Gursky, another GM veteran, inserted himself as CEO in an attempt to turn around the troubled electric trucking company. And again, Nikola shares, they are up now by 30%. Some of the other stories that we're following, Clorox, it is warning that a cyber attack it originally reported last month will have a material impact on its earnings, marking the first time the consumer products company has disclosed the extent of the attack. Clorox shares down now by 0.6%. The Oakland-based company said in a regulatory filing the cybersecurity attack damaged portions of the company's IT infrastructure, which caused widespread disruption of Clorox's operations. Chevron CEO Mike Wirth had some strong words pushing back against California's landmark lawsuit accusing Big Oil of deceiving the public about climate change. The case, Wirth says, will only benefit lawyers and politicians and do nothing to fix the environment. Nexstar Media Group and satellite TV provider DirecTV have reached a new multi-year distribution agreement covering 176 of Nexstar's local TV stations and its cable news network. And those are some of the top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We're live from Washington, where Kaylee Lyons joins the conversation in just 5 minutes. First, we get you up to date. Nancy Lyons joins with world and national news from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. 5 Americans who were imprisoned in Iran are on their way home. The U.S. agreed to a prisoner swap that will also return 5 Iranians and give Tehran access to $6 billion of its own oil revenue that the U.S. had frozen through sanctions. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hailed the agreement.
It's very good to be able to say that our fellow citizens are free after enduring something that I think it would be difficult for any of us to imagine, that their families will soon have them back among them, and that in this moment, at least, I have something very joyful to report.
Secretary Blinken says today's release follows months of negotiations. He thanked the leaders of Qatar, Oman, Switzerland, and the UK for helping win the release of the 5 Americans. Iran's president says today's deal will definitely help in building trust. President Biden has a busy week planned, with New York his first stop. He's scheduled to address the United Nations General Assembly tomorrow. He'll also hold meetings with several world leaders, including Brazil's president and Israel's prime minister. Then on Thursday, he'll host Ukrainian President Zelensky at the White House. That visit comes as the administration pushes Congress for more funding for that country's fight against Russia. Former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark is in court today seeking to have his Georgia election interference case moved to federal court. He's one of 5 defendants in the Fulton County case that have sought that move. Former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows tried but failed to have his case shifted to federal court. The same judge is hearing Clark's case today. A rapidly intensifying storm in the Atlantic has developed into a hurricane. The National Hurricane Center in Miami says Nigel is a fast-paced storm that is expected to strengthen into a major hurricane by tomorrow. It poses, though, no immediate threat to land. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe.
Nancy, thank you. It was considered the end of an era here in Washington when the prime rib on K Street stopped requiring neckties at dinner. You still need a jacket. I think they'll still give you one. But what we just saw in the Senate is a new level here, where the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, has directed the Sergeant-at-Arms to no longer enforce the chamber's informal dress code for members. This is in the chamber itself, when you debate and vote, as he makes room for John Fetterman, of course, the senator from Pennsylvania, known more for his shorts and hoodie sweatshirts than the suits he was wearing when he first came to Washington. And I'd love to hear from Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano on this, remembering I asked him about this 2 Januaries ago, when he was lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. And remember, he showed up at that bridge collapse that happened around Pittsburgh. President Biden went up there. He was wearing shorts, sneakers, and a hoodie. And I asked him if he was elected, would you wear shorts on the Senate floor?
Geez, I don't anticipate that. That's more of a getting ahead of ourselves here. I just, as soon as I found out what happened, I immediately rushed to the scene, and I went the way I was dressed. And that's how I showed up. I obviously wasn't trying to make fashion sense or history there, but that was just how things worked out.
But indeed, he has made fashion history. Rick Davis, they changed the dress code in the Senate so he can wear the shorts on the floor.
Yeah, is that a question? I mean, look, I mean, there are parts of this dress code that are outdated, right? And people like, Senator Sinema have protested that. And,
yes, right.
Women have to wear things on their shoulders. I mean, it's ridiculous. That being said, my first job in politics was with Ronald Reagan, who never took his jacket off in the Oval Office.
Right.
I like that.
How about it, Jeannie? Do you need a tie, a jacket on the floor?
No, you don't. And they should loosen up for staff and reporters as well.
All right, that's fine. I don't know. Can you picture me here in a hoodie in the studio at Bloomberg in Washington? I don't think that's going to work with the members. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano, hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
We're talking about red and blue division within states. How busy is Donald Trump's legal team going to be? Is the economy stupid? Is that actually what will decide this race?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
Federal spending combined with too lax monetary policy has produced this 40-year high in inflation.
China policy is driven basically by domestic politics.
American families are finding themselves further behind the 8 ball.
To get anything done in this Congress, it's going to have to be done in a bipartisan way.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
The math is not getting easier. Welcome to hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Kaylee Lines joins the conversation this hour with a new budget deal emerging in the House. But passing the bill is a different matter. We'll talk shutdown politics with Mick Mulvaney, the former congressman who co-founded the Freedom Caucus, ran the budget, and served as acting chief of staff in the Trump administration with his insights. Later, the United Nations General Assembly opens with news of a prisoner swap between the U.S. and Iran. We'll talk with Bloomberg national security reporter Nick Wadhams. And how about it? The Texas Attorney General cleared of all charges in his impeachment trial. Bloomberg's Dallas Bureau Chief Julie Fine will join us to tell us how that all happened. First, though, Wall Street. Charlie Pellet has an update on trading for us. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew. Fed week. We have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing, but stocks have hit the hold button in the run-up to Wednesday's decision. Little change right now on the S&P, up by 9 points, a gain of just about 0.2%, holding at 44.59. The Dow's up 55, up 0.2%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 25 points, in the advance right now of 0.2%. The Russell 2000 in the red. Small cap shares down by about 0.4%. 10-year yield 4.31% with a 2-year that's yielding 5.05%. Gold up 0.4%, 1932 the ounce, and Bitcoin 26,765 on Bitcoin, up now by 1.2%. Energy, a major story today. We've got Brent at 93.97. It is little changed. It is higher, up by just about 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude 90.98 a barrel, up 21 cents. Higher by 0.2%. Citigroup says oil prices should ease as a result of an increase in supply from countries other than OPEC Plus leaders Saudi Arabia and Russia. As for the outlook for energy, Amrita Sen is the founder of Energy Aspects, and she was interviewed this morning on surveillance.
Yes, crude is getting all the headlines now. We're talking about it. But if you look at products and crack spreads, that have already been high for the last few months. Gasoline, diesel, they've been trading at $120+ per barrel. Crude was 80. Now crude's catching up, but those prices haven't necessarily gone up further.
The crack spread, by the way, is the difference between the price of finished products and the cost of crude. And you can hear more of the conversation with Amrita Sen on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Again, crude oil is advancing today. Right now, West Texas Intermediate up 0.1% among energy names. ExxonMobil up 0.6%. ADRs of BP down 0.7%. Chevron shares, they're up by 0.3%. Stocks higher, S&P up 10, a gain of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York. We thank you from here in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew, now joined by Kaylee Lines here in the Bloomberg Washington, D.C. Bureau. Good to see you. As we pick up a new week with the same issues we ended the last week with, and by that I mean day 4 on the strike.
Yep.
Or I guess third full day, we're saying technically. And a deal on the budget. Just no celebration yet. This is pretty interesting now. We talked about it with the panel last hour. Main Street Caucus, Freedom Caucus.
Right.
Cats and dogs living together. 8% budget cut. But can they pass it?
This is the question. And when we say Freedom Caucus, we aren't really talking about the whole Freedom Caucus who has agreed to this, because you already have a number of those members who said they would vote no to this agreement between these two different factions. Obviously, one far right, one more center right. What they agreed to also includes some measures that would pretty much make it dead on arrival in a Democratic-controlled Senate, whether it relates to the border and asylum granted to migrants, constructing the border wall, those deep spending cuts that they probably aren't going to like. And there's nothing in there for Ukraine or disaster relief that the president has asked for.
Let me just put this right back in my mind. So we've seen this movie before, it feels like.
Yeah.
There was a great headline on the terminal. Government funding fight. This is Bloomberg Government now. Government funding fight, just round 2 of the debt ceiling brawl. Ain't that the truth?
Deja vu all over again.
Right. This is why we talk to Mick Mulvaney every week, because there's always an update on this stuff. And Mick's been there on both sides of it. Capitol Hill, the White House, even ran the budget. So we've got some stuff for Mick Mulvaney today. It's great to have you back, Mick. Of course, former OMB director, former member of Congress who co-founded the Freedom Caucus. Every time Speaker McCarthy seems to think he's got a deal together here, Mick, it's just a couple of noisy members of that Freedom Caucus who burst the balloon. Is this actually going to get a vote on Thursday?
Hey, Joe. Hey, Kaylee. The more things change, the more they stay the same, it seems.
How true.
Look, and the difficulty he's got is just math, right? He's got maybe a 4-seat, maybe a 5-seat margin, depending on who shows up or who quits between now and the end of the week, or who gets thrown in jail. I don't know what's going on with some of these members. And when you've got a margin that narrow, any 4 or 5 folks can throw a monkey wrench in, and that's exactly what you see happening. I was stunned, by the way, that the Main Street folks and some of the right-wing folks were able to come to a deal. I was impressed. That's pretty good work. And if that doesn't satisfy everybody, then the chances of getting anything out of the House just on Republican votes probably isn't very good at all.
Yeah, and of course, this is something that Speaker McCarthy would like to avoid eventually, even if he can get it through the House. He doesn't want to see a government shutdown. Take a listen, Mick, to what he said on one of the Sunday shows on Fox over the weekend.
A shutdown would only give strength to the Democrats. It would give the power to Biden. It wouldn't pay our troops. It wouldn't pay our border agents. More people would be coming across. I actually want to achieve something.
He wants to achieve something, and he went on to say, Mick, that a shutdown would just weaken the Republicans' hand. Would it weaken Speaker McCarthy's hand most of all?
Actually, no. I'll give you the counter on that one. I think that you sort of get the sense. I spent all last week in Washington, last week talking to folks across the spectrum, and you sort of get the impression that the middle of the party, I'm not talking about the Main Street folks, I'm not talking about the Republican Study Committee, which sort of leans right, or even the Freedom Caucus people that are okay with perhaps this deal. And again, this is not a Freedom Caucus mutiny. It's a small group of people. The Freedom Caucus at any time is roughly maybe 40 members, and you need about 80% of those to take an official position. They're nowhere near that. So this is a rump group who happen to be Freedom Caucus members who are causing all the difficulty. And honestly, I think the more unreasonable they are being, the more it helps Kevin. And that sooner or later, and it may be, I think, after a shutdown, you might see an overwhelming number of Republicans go to Kevin and say, it's okay with us if you start talking to Democrats about things that are reasonable, because it's the only way we're going to pass anything. And that, if it happens, might actually strengthen Kevin and really undermine these 5 to 10 folks who just say no to everything at this point.
Interesting. So that would unlock a little bit of negotiating across the aisle in that world. Mick, Elise Stefanik described this as a good place. She said House Republicans are in a good place right now. We've got a deal. When she was asked also on Fox News Sunday, how would you describe the place that the Republican whip is in today?
Listen, I think the meltdown last week was a watershed moment. The line that Kevin said when he said, just bring the effing motion, let's get this over with. That's a watershed moment, because what I think he's realized is that, number one, he's never going to satisfy everybody in the caucus, and he needs to satisfy just about everybody in the caucus to pass something with just Republican votes. But just as importantly, I think he's realized nobody else wants the job. Nobody else could get elected speaker, and even if they did, they wouldn't want the gig. And I think that actually helps Kevin's hand, because it sort of allows him to call these folks bluff. And I think you saw the opening salvo of that last week when Kevin challenged them to bring the motion. Notice, by the way, they didn't take him up on his offer. That Matt Gaetz's response is, please bring us the appropriations bills. And I get that. Listen, I get what's causing this. I get the angst with the spending. I get the lack of a budget, which I think they're going to solve this week. They're actually going to pass a top-line budget number, which is some of the things that the fiscal conservatives have been complaining about. Those are legitimate concerns. But I think Kevin is finally realizing that the more this small group pushes and pushes and pushes, the more it actually helps him in strengthening his own hand.
As we talk about this small group, Mick, over the weekend, the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, characterized what is happening among House Republicans as a civil war. Do you think that's an apt description?
Is it any different than the internal discussions in the Democrat Party? I mean, look, David Ignatius wrote a piece in the Washington Post last week saying that Joe Biden shouldn't run again and that Kamala Harris shouldn't run either. You want to talk about a civil war? Oh, my goodness. When that outlet, with that author, is taking that position, then there are discussions going on with the Democrats that are just as civil war-ish as the Republican discussions are. So, yeah, I don't think Hakeem is wrong, but to think that it's not like that with both parties in Washington, D.C. is naive.
I'd like to ask you about something else that's making news here in Washington, Mick, and that's the prisoner swap with Iran. Some folks are very upset about this. A lot of Republican lawmakers are criticizing President Biden as it's not only a swap for 5 Iranian detainees, Iranian prisoners, but it's also unlocking $6 billion that apparently was being held by South Korea. This is oil money, apparently destined for Iran, which says it will use it any way it sees fit, even though this was supposed to be for humanitarian purposes. You spent enough time in OMB to probably understand some of the inner workings here. First of all, was this the right move to unlock that money? And how does the Biden administration do this without the help of Congress?
Yeah, these are tough. I mean, the prisoner swaps are really tough because, we tend really not to take people into, arrest people in this country for political purposes, especially foreign citizens, right? We don't go off and take a Russian because we want to be able to use that person as a brokering chip, and the Russians do and the Iranians do. It's always difficult when we see our innocent citizens being held overseas, and you got to, I sympathize with the Biden administration for the position they're in. We had it from time to time. Actually, one of the things that President Trump was really, really good at was these prisoner negotiations and so forth. The difficulty with doing it the way that the Biden administration is doing it, they're couching in terms of money only for, medicine and food, is that, as every listener of this program knows, money is 100% fungible. In fact, it is the ultimate fungible thing, right? And now, instead of having to spend $6 billion on food, the Iranians will be able to take this $6 billion and spend that $6 billion we just gave them on food and use the $6 billion they were going to spend on food to buy weapon systems, which is exactly what they mean when they say they can spend this money every way that they want to. The answer to your question, by the way, deals with the abilities under the various laws that have already been passed. That we give the State Department a great deal of authority. We give the administration a great deal of authority. It's part of the execution of the laws. Typically speaking, if it's done properly, it is a proper function of the executive branch of government to cut these deals.
Interesting. Senator Ted Cruz issued a statement that says President Biden has established a secret nuclear deal with the Iranian regime that's being kept from Congress and the American people. He says today's news confirms there has already been a side deal, including a $6 billion ransom and the release of Iranian operatives. That is not good politics for the White House. Is it fair language? Ransom?
Well, it is ransom, right? I mean, that's exactly what it is. They took our people and we're paying them money. It is absolutely ransom. Like I said, this is a tough position for any administration to be in because that type of criticism is absolutely right. And the reason you don't like to pay ransom is that all it does is encourage people to do it again next time. So we used to have a policy in this country that we didn't negotiate with terrorists, but clearly the Biden administration has done just that. But again, when it's innocent Americans being held, the sympathy levels are very, very high. I don't know where Ted is getting this issue about a larger nuclear deal. I think there's plenty of here to criticize without going that far, unless he's got evidence that he's not talking about. I'd be surprised, by the way, if that had happened. It wouldn't surprise me they would do it. I just can't see how they would do it in secret. The Democrats have wanted a deal on Iranian nuclear weapons for a long time. We tried to undo it. But I don't know what Ted is talking about when it comes to that, but maybe you can ask him.
Mick, while we're on the subject of foreign relations, of course, later on this week, we're going to be looking forward here in Washington to a visit from Ukrainian President Zelensky, both at the White House and on Capitol Hill. And a headline just crossed the Bloomberg terminal, Reuters reporting that McCarthy says he will meet with Zelensky this week. That's, of course, as McCarthy is dealing with parts of his Republican Party in the House that would no longer like to help Ukraine in regard to funding for the war with Russia. When Zelensky makes the trip and pleas for more, do you think it's going to fall on deaf ears in the House? Can minds change on this issue?
Yeah, in fact, they're already changing. Not on deaf ears, but they're going to be cynical ears. There's no question. I think the days of writing a blank check to Ukraine have come and gone. You've already seen the reports starting to leak out about the lack of accountability by the Ukrainians. People forget, and they want to forget, especially folks on the other side of the aisle want to forget because they want to just look at Ukraine in terms of a Trump issue. But one of the reasons that we withheld money for the Ukrainians in the first place was because they're one of the most corrupt places on the planet. There's actually special rules on the books in our country about giving money to Ukraine in terms of foreign aid. There's limitations that only apply to Ukraine because it is so corrupt. And you're starting to see that now come home to roost. This is one of those interesting topics, Kaylee, that is not necessarily right down the middle partisan. There's going to be Democrats who are interested in not spending more money in Ukraine. There's going to be Republicans who want to be interested in not spending more money in Ukraine. You're going to see a very healthy debate, I think, on this particular issue. I don't think Zelensky comes to deaf ears, but I don't think he comes now to folks who are willing to write him a blank check.
And Mick, I have one last question for you, because when you were on the show last week, you had some love expressed for Congressman Ken Buck, the Republican from Colorado. And he on Friday published an op-ed in the Washington Post I wanted to ask you about. It's in regard to the impeachment inquiry. And this is a quote: Republicans in the House who are itching for an impeachment are relying on an imagined history. He goes on to say Trump's impeachment in 2019 was a disgrace to the Constitution and a disservice to Americans. The GOP's reprise in 2023 is no better. Mick, what's your response to that?
Ken Buck is a really, really conservative guy. Okay, this is not somebody from the middle of the party. This is a right winger. When he's saying that, people should pay attention. He's also a very thoughtful guy. He's well regarded within the party, and I don't know if he's right or wrong because I haven't seen the evidence. I also encourage people to recognize there's a difference between an impeachment inquiry and an impeachment. People want to sort of blur the lines between those two things. People forget there was an impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump in 2019 before there was an impeachment. And I don't necessarily disagree with the decision to do an inquiry. But when Buck is coming out and saying that, people should pay attention because he's a thoughtful person, and he might be right. He might, say, look, if we do this, then are we just as bad? Are we just as awful as the Democrats? Or is there not a moral high ground here that we can take? I remember back in 2011 and 12, when I came in on the Tea Party wave, there was this inkling every now and then from back home about impeaching Barack Obama. And I used to ask the same question. Where's the high crime and misdemeanor? Show me a high crime and misdemeanor that we can have the discussion. I think that's the same thing you're hearing from Ken Buck today. Show me a crime and we'll talk about impeachment.
There you have it from Mick Mulvaney. We thank you, Mick, as always, with us here on Bloomberg Sound On. Do I have to go through all the formers? Acting Chief of Staff, former Congressman, OMB Director. There are others.
Titles.
There are others, yeah.
With
Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
updates, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We have got Apple leading gains in mega cap stocks higher across the board right now. Apple up by 2.4%. NASDAQ up 28 points, up 0.2%. S&P up 9, also higher by 0.2%. And the Dow up 60 right now, also up 0.2%. 10-year yield 4.31% with the 2-year now at 5.06%. Gold up $7.50 the ounce to $19.31, up by about 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.4%, $91.13 for a barrel of WTI. American home builder sentiment has fallen to a 5-month low as higher mortgage rates continue to push many prospective buyers out of the market. The National Association of Home Builders Wells Fargo Index declined 5 points to 45 after sliding 6 points a month earlier. Now, that does mark the largest back-to-back decrease in nearly a year. Again, recapping, U.S. stocks are advancing. We have got the S&P up by 9, a gain there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
5 Americans are heading back home because of the prisoner swap with Iran that unfolded earlier today. It was 104 degrees, Kaylee, on the tarmac in Doha, where this took place. We actually did see their activities as they were walking around there, but we heard as well from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who, like Joe Biden, now we've learned, spoke with the families. He spoke with the Americans being freed. Here's what he said.
After they landed in Doha, I can tell you that it was, for them, for me, an emotional conversation. It's easy in the work that we do every day sometimes to get lost in the abstractions of foreign policy and relations with other countries and forgetting the human element that's at the heart of everything we do.
For this story, we turn to Nick Wadhams, Bloomberg national security reporter. He's going to talk to us about more than this, Kaylee. But Nick is, of course, up in New York as UNGA gets good. Can we just call it the UNGA? I feel like
please don't call it UNGA.
It's just kind of...
Neither rolls off the tongue.
No, it sounds
like
ugly.
An invasive medical procedure or something.
Yes, right. Nobody wants an UNGA, Nick. I don't know. He looked almost emotional to me. I don't know about you. The Secretary of State, he had clearly just gotten off the phone with these Americans. The president also, according to notes, had a conversation described as emotional. We forget about this part of the story when we cover the policy end, to his point, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's, amid all the abstraction, the conversations, the diplomatic contretemps that happen all the time, it can be considered a major win when President Biden gets 5 Americans home. They'd been there, Siamak Namazi, one of the prisoners who came home, had been in Iran in prison for 8 years. So, there's some criticism coming from Republicans and even some Democrats, but, this is a big deal. This is an actual success that they can point to.
But on the subject of that criticism, Nick, I caught up with Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee on Capitol Hill last week, and he said the U.S. has just put $1 billion price tag on every American's head through this, since we've seen that $6 billion in funds that is now allowed to be transferred to Iran. What precedent is being set here?
Well, I mean, definitely there is some concern that, the Biden administration had said all along, this is not a quid pro quo. We are not allowing them to access this money in exchange for the prisoner release. But obviously the timing sort of puts paid to that. And there has been a lot of concern, when you had the Brittany Griner trade for Victor Bout in Russia, that by actually entering into these sort of negotiations and doing these kind of deals, the U.S. is creating incentives. This one is a little more complicated. I don't give the Republicans a ton of leeway in that criticism because the money that was in those South Korean bank accounts, that $6 billion, that was money that was sent to Iran as part of a whole sanctions waiver program when Iran was allowed to sell oil, and those waivers were extended under the Trump administration. So you had a situation where the Trump administration was saying, okay, Iran, in limited cases, countries like South Korea, we're going to allow you to sell oil, and now they're coming back on the other side and criticizing the Biden administration for allowing Iran to access that money.
Well, that's important because we're hearing from Republicans, to Kaylee's point, including Ted Cruz. His statement was the most pronounced that I've seen, at least so far, Nick. He says that the president's established a secret nuclear deal with the Iranian regime that's being kept from Congress and the American people. He says today's news confirms there's already been a side deal, including a $6 billion ransom. How should the administration answer to that charge then? It sounds like... You might have just written it for them.
Well, I mean, what they have said in the past is, okay, listen, Iran, this money is put into an account where Iran is allowed to access it for humanitarian goods, medicine, food, and things like that. Obviously, their counter is money is fungible. So the money that Iran is not spending on those things it can use for, to sow terror and do other malign activity in the region. So, there is that counter argument. As to Ted Cruz's argument that there is a sort of shadow secret nuclear deal, I mean, the facts just simply don't bear that out at the moment. There is no deal. The deal has been basically blown up, as it was in 2018. I mean, and to be fair, Ted Cruz was criticizing the Trump administration for allowing these waivers that allowed Iran to sell oil to South Korea and other countries back then. So, but I mean, safe to say anything that the Biden administration does with Iran is going to come in for criticism from the Republicans who basically want a totally maximalist position on this.
But as we talk about the idea of a nuclear deal that, as you say, was blown up several years ago, even if we can't return to the 2015 deal, is there the construct of a deal that looks like it could be taking shape going forward? I just wonder how the agreement we've seen here in regard to these prisoners and the transfer of these funds may pave the way for a little bit more diplomacy between the U.S. and Iran.
So what administration officials have said is basically, this removes an irritant. It removes an obstacle. It allows them to potentially get in the room to have more conversations. And they're not going to admit to anything formal, because if they do anything formal, it's probably going to be almost immediately rejected by Congress. But what you do seem to see is these sort of tentative explorations on the margins. Okay, Iran slows its pace of enrichment. It seems to be taking some sort of potentially good faith steps. The U.S. has done this thing where it's not clamping down quite as hard on Iranian oil sales into China. So it does feel like, I mean, the administration vehemently denies that it's taking these measures, but it just does feel like there's a little more flexibility here. And it feels like both sides want to say, okay, let's clear the distractions, the irritants, the obstacles off the table, and then maybe we can do something. I mean, Blinken today in New York called the nuclear program the U.S.'s #1 concern when it comes to Iran. So this is obviously a huge priority for them.
Ukraine is another priority here at this United Nations General Assembly, certainly for this administration, Nick, and we're hearing louder and louder pushback in Washington, with some Republicans saying not another dollar, others calling for an audit or more controlled distribution of funds. But whether the appetite is there now, I wonder if we look ahead this week. President Zelensky will meet with President Biden. He will also meet now with Speaker McCarthy following the United Nations General Assembly. Will it do anything to move this debate?
That's a great question. I think the issue is that the votes are there. I mean, in Congress generally, the support is pretty strong for continued aid to flow to to Ukraine. But obviously, it's not going to change the view of the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Matt Gaetzes, the folks who are vehemently opposed to further aid at any cost, and can gum it up and make that process a lot more challenging. The other issue is, of course...
Is that it, though, Nick? Is it really just fringe at this point, or is that becoming a more mainstream thought, or mainstream objection?
Well, there's the fringe who say not another penny evermore. Then there's the sort of broader group of people who say, okay, listen, we are willing to send aid to Ukraine but we want it to be very closely scrutinized. And then there's the broader group, which is quite general, which is sort of like, okay, well, how long is this thing going to go for? I mean, there was the hope that the U.S. would come in with a lot of money early out of the gate, very strong, a lot of weapons, a lot of munitions and things like that, and that could repel the Russians. But we're now sort of looking at this situation where it looks like this conflict could drag on for several years. I mean, that is a distinct possibility. And so then you get the question, okay, what happens in 2025 if Trump wins? What happens if there's some other crisis? Are you able to sustain? I mean, the U.S. gave almost $40 billion in aid and weapons last year. Are they going to be able to do that every year until this thing ends, if that ever actually happens?
Yeah, Nick, just quickly, we only have about a minute left, but what do U.S. stockpiles look like at this point? Because obviously we've been drawing them down, and I just wonder how much there is even left to give.
Well, the big question is artillery. I mean, this has really been a war that has been fought between artillery, and the simple fact is that Ukraine is just going through those artillery shells at such a faster rate that it can be produced. There will be a ramp up in that by both the U.S. and European nations, but that's not expected for, at least another year. So there's just a fundamental mismatch there between, what the U.S. can give and what Ukraine is spending.
Who makes that stuff, Nick? We always talk about the Lockheeds, the F-35s, the whiz-bang defense programs. Who makes the old-fashioned stuff like mortar rounds and bullets?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, not very many companies make these artillery shells anymore, precisely because the U.S. said, this is going to the war of the future is going to be high-tech F-35 planes, nuclear submarines and things like that. No one's going to need artillery shells. So in some cases, the U.S. is going to other countries like South Korea and even countries, elsewhere in the world to get these munitions.
High tech, but apparently not high tech enough to find them after we lose them. You've heard about Can we get a Find My Phone for the F-35?
Someone should have air tagged.
Right. Where's the air tag for the F-35? You heard they lost one in Charleston.
Only $100 million.
Nick, great to see you. Yeah, it's just a rounding error. Nick Wadham's with us from the Fishbowl, as we call it in New York, Bloomberg headquarters, where the UNGA is getting underway. I'll try not to do that going forward. Let's get up to date on the news now. Nancy Lyons joins with world and national news from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. As you've been hearing here on Bloomberg, 5 Americans are on their way home as part of a prisoner swap that will return 5 Iranians to Tehran that they'd been held in the U.S. The deal also allows Iran to access $6 billion of its oil money that was frozen due to sanctions. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will be holding meetings and lobbying for more financial support this week as world leaders gather at the United Nations. He'll also be bringing his message to Washington, where he'll push lawmakers to approve an additional $24 billion in aid that's been proposed by President Biden. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern says it'll be a tough sell for Zelensky.
How does he convince Republican lawmakers that at the moment are still unnerved and concerned about sending more taxpayer dollars to Ukraine that they should pass that bill? Remember, the U.S. administration, the White House, asked for in a supplemental spending bill more Ukraine aid, and that Ukraine aid was missing from that CR that the Republicans were discussing last night in a phone call.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern reporting. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Profits. Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We begin with a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. Banco Santander is planning a major overhaul of its reporting structure. That news breaking right now with a headline on the Bloomberg Professional Service. We've got stocks higher across the board. A Monday advance for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. A lot of people, though, on hold ahead of the Fed's decision on Wednesday. 7-point gain right now on the S&P at 44.58, higher by about 0.2%. We've got the Dow up 44, up 0.1%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 20, a gain of 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100 index up by 37 points, up by about 0.2%. Apple shares helping lead today's advance. Right now, we've got Apple up by just about 2.5%. 10-year yield, 4.31%. The 2-year, 5.06% now on the 2-year. Spot gold up $7 the ounce to $19.11. That is a gain of 0.4%. And West Texas Intermediate crude at $91.35 a barrel. WTI up by about 0.6%. Investors are looking ahead to the Federal Reserve's interest rate announcement on Wednesday. An economist Nouriel Roubini, the chairman of Roubini Macro Associates, says the Fed's work isn't done yet.
I don't think they can say they are done because the economy is still growing above potential. Headline inflation is going higher now that oil prices are going higher, and therefore potentially they have to leave the option open that there'll be another hike.
Meta Platforms, the parent of Facebook and Instagram, has been reviving a number of pre-pandemic perks to get people back in the office. Among those perks, happy hours and branded T-shirts. Meta bouncing back from a morale crisis that set in after 20,000 of their teammates were laid off over the past year. Meta Platform shares up now by 0.7%. Again, recapping, we do have stocks advancing with the S&P up 8, a gain there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
It's a good Monday if you are Ken Paxton, waking up this morning in Texas cleared of all charges. This, of course, following his impeachment trial that we talked about. Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, cleared of all 16 articles of impeachment. Went right into the weekend. They voted on Saturday, I believe, Kaylee.
Yep.
A 9-day trial in Austin. Ken Paxton, a free man.
Indeed. Not found guilty of any of those allegations that included bribery, abusing his office. Only 2 of the 19 Republicans voted to convict him on any of these 16 counts.
Yes.
Had he been convicted of even just one, he would have been removed for office. And instead, he lives to see another day.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. We heard from one of the impeachment managers, a Democrat named Ann Johnson, state rep. Here's what she said right after he was cleared.
The Board of Managers presented overwhelming evidence that Ken Paxton is the most corrupt politician in the state of Texas at this time. And the Republicans in the Texas Senate just returned him to the office of top cop. I will rely on what I said on the floor of the Texas House. God help us.
God help us, she says. Only 2 of the 19 Republicans voting for conviction on any of the articles, and that meant it was a working weekend for Julie Fine.
Indeed.
Bloomberg's Dallas bureau chief joins us. She helped get us ready for this. She helped us live through it. Now we've survived it. Julie, is this Texas just being Texas? What's going on here when there's an apparently overwhelming case and you're cleared of all 16 charges? Was this on the impeachment managers themselves?
Well, I will say this. You heard from the Democrat impeachment manager, but remember, this is a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, and the Republicans voted for this impeachment. So this wasn't like a group of Democrats just going after a Republican. I mean, this is a majority. There was only 23 people that voted against him in the Texas House. It's a very overwhelmingly Republican Senate, and you needed 21 votes. What was very interesting is that Ken Paxton's wife was there. She wasn't allowed to vote, but she made that threshold higher to get the 2/3 vote. So I don't know if you can pin this on the impeachment managers. I mean, I think there's so much at play here, but it will be very interesting to see what this means for the Republican Party in Texas moving forward. Right now, lawmakers are expected to be called back for a special session regarding school vouchers. What's going to be very interesting in this is that the lieutenant governor who presided as judge in this basically blasted the House after saying this was rushed, shouldn't have been done so quickly, etc. So he blasted the House Speaker blasted back. It's just going to be very messy for this Republican Party in Texas right now.
Yeah, definitely a lot of individuals that play within Texas itself. But Julie, I have to wonder about external forces at work as well, specifically a former President Trump, posting on Truth Social earlier today. This is a quote. "It is true that my intervention through Truth Social saved Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton from going down at the hands of Democrats and some Republicans." He goes on to say, "It was my honor to have helped correct this injustice." Julie, what role did Trump actually play here?
I'm not sure we really know, because he wasn't he made a few posts. Now, behind the scenes, was he calling people? Hard to say. There was a gag order in this. I mean, there's been discussions that a lot of people that were talking that shouldn't have been talking, that of course being rumors, but I think that whatever role he played, the former president certainly is going to put out there that he was involved. I mean, they're very close. The two of them are they're very, very close.
Talked a lot about Ken Paxton and his marriage, as his wife, of course, member of the Senate, who did not take part in the trial, was in the room for some pretty excruciating details about an extramarital affair. Do they sail off into the sunset together here, Julie?
I mean, I certainly am never going to comment on anybody else's marriage. I think we all know better than that. But I do think that, she did stand by him through this entire thing. I know there were a lot of reporters that were outside of her door after this ended. She was nowhere to be seen. It's a lot to go through. So you gotta kind of wonder, to go through all this and then it not to work out. I mean, he spoke glowingly of her in his statement. So it certainly is a lot to go through. What was very interesting, she tried to make sure she wasn't recused. She did not step down. It was the Senate, in terms of her vote. It was the Senate that said, you can't vote. Just to sit there through all that. And you got to remember, everyone's watching you watch this trial go on.
Brutal.
Yeah, it is not an envious position to be in for any person. Julie, as we think about how all of this went down in Texas, what it perhaps reveals about the Texan Republican Party, are there parallels to be drawn here with what we're seeing more broadly within the Republican Party on a national level, in Congress, certainly here in Washington?
Well, what always I think about is when you always see sometimes a group that's smaller than the regular group. What I'm trying to explain is, if you look at the Texas House, most voted to impeach. The Senate is a little bit different. So is it that there's a vocal minority, or is this really the Republican Party at this point? Is it really the former president's Republican Party, or is it a different Republican Party? And I think that's what we're going to find out during the election. This is very interesting to me to see Republican on Republican here in the state of Texas, but to some degree, and you guys know this because you're in Washington, you see it a little bit with the Freedom Caucus as well. Yeah. So it's which voice does win out. Which voice? Currently, when you look at the Republican Party, you're looking at, the former president. He's running away with this. But then, I'm sure you've talked to many people that say, then polls show many are looking for a different candidate, but that doesn't stick. Yeah. So, there you are.
Julie, great to see you. And thanks for joining us in Austin, just back from Washington, D.C., just in time for the impeachment vote. Great to see you. Our Dallas bureau chief, ever mobile in the state of Texas. A lot more to talk about and some final thoughts ahead with Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Stay with us on the fastest hour in politics. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Nikola Corp shares are surging 32% after the company reported former GM president Mary Chan as its new chief operating officer. The hire comes a month after Nikola chairman Steve Gursky, another GM veteran, as CEO in an attempt to turn the troubled electric trucking company around. Clorox is warning that a cyber attack it originally reported last month will have a material impact on its earnings, marking the first time the consumer products company has disclosed the extent of the attack. Clorox shares down by 1.2%. Citigroup will eliminate layers of management focused on specific regions as part of CEO Jane Fraser's biggest restructuring in at least 2 decades. David Livingstone, who was named the firm's chief client officer, was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
So we now have a structure which fits our strategy. So our strategy didn't change on Jane's announcement last Wednesday. What did change is the structure that's going to implement that. And in my new role as the chief client officer, which is a new role in Citi, is very much to say we cover clients around the world, tens of thousands of them and millions of them in the US in our personal banking business. Are we doing it the best way we possibly can? Are we as coherent as we can? And are we delighting them as much as we possibly can with our capabilities?
And Citigroup shares now down by about 0.1%. You can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. Download it wherever you get your podcasts. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
They're still looking for the F-35. How a stealth fighter jet goes missing remains a big question around here, and we'll tackle that next after we get up to date on world and national news. Nancy Lyons has that from the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. 5 Americans are now free after a prisoner exchange between the U.S. and Iran. President Biden is applauding the agreement that led to their freedom that also involved the release of 5 Iranians that were in U.S. custody. He thanked the leaders of Qatar and Oman for helping facilitate the agreement that also includes freeing up $6 billion in frozen Iranian assets. Well, it's day 4 of the auto workers' strike with little to no progress being made over the weekend. Stellantis did bump up its pay hike offer to 21%, but that was quickly rejected by the union. Bloomberg's Detroit bureau chief David Welch says some of the union asks will never be met by the big 3 automakers.
They're willing to move on pay, obviously. They're already up over 20%, and I think they'll continue to bump that, not interminably, but they will. That's something they can play with. But those other retiree benefits and a 32-hour work week, I don't think they'll budge on either one of those.
Bloomberg's David Welch reporting from Detroit. Hunter Biden is suing the IRS, claiming so-called whistleblowers illegally disclosed information about his taxes. Bloomberg News legal reporter David Voriakis explains why Hunter Biden and his legal team believe the 2 IRS employees do not deserve whistleblower protections.
Essentially, they're saying that most whistleblowers uncover government misconduct and not the details of an employee's opinion about the alleged wrongdoing of a private person. That's how Hunter Biden argues it in the lawsuit. And that in this case, these 2 investigators are not normal whistleblowers and presumably are not entitled to the same sort of whistleblower protections.
Bloomberg's David Voriakis reporting. A judge in Georgia heard arguments today from former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark. He wants his election interference case moved to federal court. The judge has already rejected similar efforts by former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Joe and Kaylee.
All right, Nancy, thank you. So we're looking for a jet. This is a tweet that went out. It's funny, you know, I started in small town radio when I was a kid. We actually used to announce on the air missing pets. You know, we've got it's Jack the cat, black and white spots. Here's the number 203. This is all I could think of. Joint Base Charleston. We're working to locate an F-35 involved in a mishap this afternoon. Pilot ejected safely. Anyone with information, call the base, 843-936-3600.
So call if you have any information on this missing $100 million aircraft.
You've got to be kidding me. Since apparently, look, the pilot ejected, they think maybe it fell into a lake. That's where we are with this.
I guess. I mean, my dad, as you know, Joe, flew F-14s. He always
Tomcat
said,
pilot.
there's no reason to jump out of a perfectly good airplane.
Right.
You only jump out of the airplanes that are not perfectly good. This is his argument for why I should never go skydiving. But
Incredible.
it just goes to show you that clearly something was amiss.
Yeah,
if this
right.
plane cannot be found. It's too stealth. Too stealth. They took the stealth too far, Joe.
That's a good line, and it might actually end up being true if they literally don't know where this is. I think you made a comment about an AirTag earlier. It seems like I can find my phone. We can't find the most advanced fighter jet in the world. The insider is pointing us, though, to something that happened in the Cold Wars. Maybe this is what happened here, where a MiG-23 pilot ejected, but because it was on autopilot, it kept flying for over 500 miles. It went over East and West Germany. It went over the Netherlands before this thing crashed. So maybe it's still flying.
The great mysteries of the universe, Joe.
The Belgian foreign minister at the time noted the jet had been picked up by NATO radar more than an hour before it crashed, yet no Soviet response. Are you telling me you can see the dimples on a golf ball from our satellites and we don't know where this jet is? I'm having a hard time with this one.
I hope someone finds it.
Yeah.
I don't know how. I guess you then just call the number to report it, because how do you retrieve an aircraft?
Exactly. Well, look, if I say whoever brings it back gets the 90 million, little reward for
Quite a finder's fee.
a good Samaritan. With Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthews. See you tomorrow. Bloomberg Business Week starts right now.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Live from the Bloomberg. Oh, hi.
Who is this?
Hey.
Who is this voice I hear?
Who are you? Where am I?
Who are you?
I have no idea where I am. Hi, everybody. I actually could not remember any of my Bloomberg passwords.
That's the sign of a good vacation, Carol.
And you can't do
really
any-
checked out. Yeah, I don't know how you're even here today.
I don't know. I'm here in spirit. I don't know about mind, and yeah, we'll see. You'll see. You guys can be the judge of it. It is a Monday, a rainy Monday here in New York City, September 18th. Man, September of flying happens when you're away for a couple of weeks. I'm just saying.
Well, it's good to have you back.
It's good to be back. I actually, did check in because I was curious about the inflation debate, the Fed debate, and it's all going to be relevant this week.
Well, fortunately, a lot of your time overlapped with the blackout period from Fed officials, so we didn't miss out on anything they said.
So you had nothing to talk
We
about?
had nothing to talk about the whole time. That's right.
Well,
No, there was some CPI data. That's okay.
Thank God for inflation data. The countdown is definitely on, though, to the Wednesday FOMC meeting. So we've got stocks and bonds, a little change. We're going to talk, though, about the energy markets because Brent crude approaching $95 a barrel. I'm curious with our Mike McKee what he has to say about that. He's in the studio. We're going to get to him in just a moment.
Okay, so go back to January of this year, Carol.
No way. No
No?
way.
Why? You could have,
I could say NFW, but can
you
I say
could have
that
put
on
some
air?
money on
No.
certain stocks that would move higher in the S&P 500. The unexpectedly strong performance of the S&P 500 this year, we're going to get into how Wall Street's targets are changing to reflect that.
Yeah, they're playing catch up big time, right? Not so pessimistic anymore. Hey, we're going to get into the UAW strike, day 4, how it all began with a snub of Bill Ford. I don't know if you're the UAW president, should you be doing that?
If his last name is Ford,
You
I
should
don't know.
be there.
Maybe.
Show up, people. We're also going to get into, I love this story by our Ian King, Intel's vital material in the race to power AI. We're not going to tell you what it is. It's something you're going to be very familiar with, though.
Also, the CEO of Renew is joining us on the renewable energy race and role in India.
Yeah, really cool stuff. We're going to talk about MBAs spurning McKinsey and Goldman to buy small companies. Like, who needs to be a consultant or work at Goldman?
It's all about those, raising money for a new fund.
Yeah.
And we're not talking venture capital here.
No. And then we've got a great guest, courtesy of you, a friend, someone you know well, an author, a journalist, really well-known journalist. She's got a new book out.
Yeah, it's called Taming the Street, The Old Guard, the New Deal, and FDR's Fight to Regulate American Capitalism. Diane Henriquez is going to be joining us a little bit later.
I'm really looking forward to that because it's really taking you back in terms into the history of Wall Street. All right, right now, we're going to head over to our TV colleagues, Romaine and Katie. We're going to talk about the markets. Countdown to the close starts right now.
Countdown to the close. Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage ahead of the U.S. market close starts right now.
This is the countdown to the close. Romaine Bostic here alongside Katie Greifeld, joined right now by our colleagues. Carol Massar sighting once again.
She's back.
Wow.
Who are you? Where am I, as I said to Tim?
Massar. I didn't even know you still worked here. Tim Senevic actually did show up, I think, for at least 2 days last week. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg
we
platforms.
We have a good contract. I'm just going to tell you.
Apparently.
Yeah, well, you do. I need to get your agent,
Were
Carol
Katie
Massar.
and Carol on vacation together?
Yeah, they were just sailing the 7 seas all the way to
invited her, but
Colorado or somewhere. I don't think
Whale
it's
of a
Colorado
time,
by
that's all I'm
boat,
going to
but they
say.
managed to do it.
Did not talk inflation. What? Didn't talk a lot about inflation or the markets, but man, I feel like I came back and, it's all out there still in a meeting where we've got, of course, a Fed meeting, or a week, I should say, where we've got a Fed meeting. What am I talking about? What are we talking about? We're talking about the oil markets because we've got, Brent going up to about $95 a barrel. We've seen a significant move up in both Brent and WTI over the last couple of weeks. And so you do wonder about some of these supply-demand metrics that are going on specifically. You've got supply curbs by Saudi Arabia and Russia. And it's coming at a time, right, Tim, where you feel like production, as people try to think about where we are shifting to in terms of energy, maybe they're not putting so much money and efforts into it.
I think the big question is for the Federal Reserve and what it means for the Fed as it tries to get inflation under control. And it comes at a time when it seems like the Fed is getting inflation under control, Katie. So high energy prices, you can strip them out all you want, but energy is really in everything.
And that's the thing that also obviously feeds into inflation expectations, what oil, what gas is doing, which of course feeds into how the Fed is thinking about policy. So we'll see how that's playing out. But I did want to pivot and talk about one of the other most read stories on the terminal other than what we're seeing in the oil market. And that's what's going on at Meta. I don't know if you guys saw this, but Meta is restoring its happy hours. It's giving out branded T-shirts once again. It's trying to boost morale.
Yeah, you said the two magic words for Carol Massar.
As it brings its
were they happy an hour?
Boost morale,
I think she just put in
or
her
was it
application.
happy hour?
Happy hour.
I don't know. I don't know how you guys feel, but what is more fun than going out to drink with your colleagues after work wearing a company T-shirt?
I got an answer for that.
Okay.
Drinking with your colleagues during work.
I was going to say, having equity in a company that's up 238% since lows of last year. I mean, I think, Romaine, that can do a lot to improve morale somewhere, too.
Yeah, I mean, money always sort of heals a lot of wounds here. But, I mean, it gets to the idea, how do you lure people back to the office? I guess in Carol Massar's case, alcohol.
No, listen, when we have alcohol during on-air time, it's because we're talking to somody who's actually, it's a business. Okay.
They're talking to winemakers. Yeah. I've been in the studio for that. It is those are good conversations. It is fun though to think about this story and Meta. When you think about this was the year of efficiency for Meta, but now they're finding, I mean, to lure workers back, you have to give them some perks.
Well, to be fair, the laundry is no longer free. It now, costs a fee to do laundry, Romaine. So not everything is back to where it was, but
do laundry where at Meta's.
Just
Meta's.
Get on the shuttle.
They have like washing machines there. You just bring your dirty laundry there.
You just
What's
bring
going
it
on there?
What is it like? Tim does darks, Katie does the pinks.
I've never worked anywhere.
No, I do.
I will tell you, they just drop their laundry off and it gets done.
You know what I think is interesting, though, in this story? It's a lot of fun. I thought what was interesting, too, is when, was it the La Croix that ran out? Like, they didn't have that in the in their kitchen?
Can you imagine?
Salt or LaCroix.
Woe is me. Oh, La Croix? Did I say La Croix?
Yeah.
I don't know.
You don't have to fancy
It's how they say it in France.
I can do French fry. What's interesting is they say, I'm just going to read from the story, morale at Meta has always tracked closely with the company's stock performance, which is more than doubled this year to an 18-month high. So there is...
Wait, you're saying when employee morale is high, the companies do better?
Not me.
Or maybe it's the other way around.
I think employees are happy when the company is doing well.
Yeah. Wow, the stock market is real life.
So what's the solution?
Well, if we were a publicly held company, we'd be like a $4 trillion company. That's all I'm going to say. Okay. Because the stock would be doing really well.
Welcome back, Carol Massar.
You're very welcome. Now I know who you all are again. All right, we're going to be back in less than an hour's time. We're going to get you down to the close on this Monday on radio, TV, YouTube, and of course, Bloomberg Originals.
I know, I missed her.
You know, if you ask, sometimes they say yes, actually. All right, we'll see you at 4 p.m., guys.
You sleep down in the soil. Nothing come from nothing, come on. Royal oil.
All right, everybody, we are going to stay a little bit with the markets here because we kind of touched on it with Katie and Romaine, but we want to talk a little bit about what's going on with Brent. We said it's, the international crude benchmark climbed to within a nickel of $95 a barrel today. You got crude futures as they went higher. Traders and analysts are increasingly talk about when and not if prices return to $100 a barrel. I remember $140 a barrel way back when.
What came after that, Carol?
I don't know.
Wasn't there?
Oh, it wasn't good.
Yeah, it wasn't good.
Oh, sorry. I'm like,
Just
what
reminding
do you
us.
mean, Tim? What do you mean?
It wasn't a good thing.
No, and I think it's interesting in terms of we've got the FOMC meeting, and we always talk about, core inflation. We take out food and energy, but I do wonder what it all means. So let's get to our market roundtable. You put me on the spot there.
Sorry, I was just
I'm not
thinking back
awake
to
yet
financial
here, buddy.
crisis. You don't have those oil numbers memorized. It's okay. I have the charts in front of me.
All right, with us is Bloomberg News international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio, along with Dr. Ellen Wald, president of Transversal Consulting, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She's also author of Saudi Inc. She is with us on Zoom from Jacksonville, Florida. I do want to start, though, with the crude story first. Ellen, Brent crude up some 12% or so in the past 3 weeks. We talk about strong demand and supply curbs by Saudi Arabia and Russia, which are huge oil powerhouses. What do you make of the move that we've seen in oil prices broadly, and what are the trends that you think we should be paying attention to as investors, and that the world should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I would say that there's what we're seeing now is not unexpected. When Saudi Arabia makes a pretty bold move like this to say, hey, we are going to be restricting our oil production by, 1 million barrels a day, basically through the end of the year, that's something that the markets are going to pay attention to. So it's not surprising that we are seeing prices rising right now, especially because, there are some other issues in some other countries. We're seeing some stoppages in Libya due to flooding. So it's not just the Saudi story, but it's definitely having an effect on prices. I think the key really, I think here to everything is really to look at why Saudi Arabia is doing this and what signals they're looking at. And they are really focused on China. And I think the fact that they are concerned about demand says something about their concerns about China. And the Saudis, I think, are very, very keyed in to what's going on in China. They have, Aramco itself has a lot of joint ventures in China. They own parts of refineries. They have contracted, to supply certain amounts of oil to China. They've got, students in Chinese universities. I mean, they are really enmeshed, I think, in China. And so if they are seeing signals that they think show some weakness in Chinese demand, or at least things that they're not comfortable increasing production, that they think that there could be some weaknesses, I really think that that's something that we need to pay attention to. And you can't just assume that China is going to have some kind of comeback. And so that's really, I think, a number one thing to pay attention to. And then the second thing I would be looking at now really is how you brought up the Fed, how they're going to respond to this. Because if you looked at what happened in August, really, essentially, there was this, they're blaming the fact that inflation didn't drop as much as they had expected, or went up more than expected simply because of oil prices.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's both, oil definitely can be a cause of inflation, but it also is impacted by inflation. Oil production can be impacted by inflation, and the Fed is not going to just abandon their target simply because oil prices are higher than they thought.
Well, I want to bring in Michael McKee, international economics and policy correspondent. Mike, and just respond to that, the idea of high oil prices making the Fed's job more difficult.
That makes the Fed's job more difficult, but she's correct. The Fed isn't going to abandon its targets because of oil prices, because they can't bring oil prices down. Now, if oil prices start to do what we would call getting into the economy, starting to affect inflation perceptions and what consumers think inflation is going to be, so that we start to see inflation expectations unmoored, then the Fed might act to send a message, but that's a long way down the road.
But come on, if you go to the pump and you fill up your SUV and it's $5 a gallon, you're thinking things are pretty expensive, Mike.
Sure, but what can the Fed do about that? That's the problem. They can raise rates all they want, and it isn't going to bring down oil prices. But, I'll back up and say, yeah, you could put the economy into recession. It would bring down oil prices because nobody would be buying oil, and people who are no longer going to work would not be buying gasoline. But the other thing is, we have a sort of situation where every time oil prices and gasoline prices in particular, because that's how it's reflected to the American people, go up significantly, they have to go higher to really affect consumer behavior. Since we had $5 gas, people are going, yeah, gasoline prices are up and that's terrible, but it's only $3.87 or whatever it is. So we will, we'll still keep going. If you get over previous highs, then people really start to get concerned.
I actually do that when I'm like, well, it could have been, or when I'm filling up. Like, one thing I want to ask before we go back to Ellen is, I also though think about the cost of this into transportation companies or just companies overall. Like, how big a factor is it in that companies then pass that on to consumers or their customers in the form of higher prices? And that's another aspect of
It's
inflation.
interesting because that should be passed along. It has been in the past. They put on a fuel surcharge, the trucking companies and the railroads. But we've also seen a decline in truckloads lately as the economy has slowed a little bit. So that offsets it a little bit. It also takes a while, again, to get into the economy. And the question the Fed can't answer is, how long are oil prices going to remain elevated? If China's demand falls, we saw U.S. gasoline demand fall dramatically last week. If that continues, then do oil prices stabilize or start to come down?
So, Ellen, what are you watching? Let's say, I don't know, what is the right timetable in the next few weeks, in the next month, in terms of kind of how the energy markets settle in, or the oil markets specifically settle in?
Yeah, well, I think that, we're already seeing prices kind of retreat from highs that we saw earlier in the day. So I'm not sure that, $100 a barrel is right around the corner. Yeah, we're pretty close. And say, a hurricane comes and threatens, production and refining and Gulf of Mexico platforms have to shut down, then, yeah, we could definitely say $100. We see triple-digit oil happen very quickly. But that's a temporary thing. That's a kind of a temporary shock to the market, and doesn't necessarily reflect the longer term conditions that we're seeing. So, I wouldn't, like fasten your seatbelts just yet. And it doesn't look like there are any hurricanes coming towards the Gulf Coast, in the foreseeable future. But I do think that we do need to look at how the economy is going. If this is going to affect the economy, I think it was interesting that the Chevron CEO kind of made a bit light of what's going on and the high prices. I mean, people in California are seeing prices over $6 a gallon, and they're looking at this and saying, yeah, I got to fill up my car, but whoa. Obviously, at a certain point, they're going to be, more and more people are going to be saying, I can't actually fill up my car. I can only put, half of what I really need into my car because I've got to pay for groceries, which are a lot higher, and rent and electricity.
Or maybe
and
I won't take that road trip with the kids because it's going to be expensive. Chevron CEO Mike Roth actually talking to our Alex Steele, great interview, and I highly recommend everybody check it out on the Bloomberg. So, Mike, come on in as we, this is part of our backdrop that the Fed is going to be dealing with, though, on Wednesday. What do you think, though, will be front and center when it comes to the Fed on Wednesday?
Well, the question of whether inflation is going to be front and center, because that makes all of their decisions and at this point. And they don't have a good handle on what's going to happen. And they have not just oil prices, but you've got student loan repayments coming up now. You've got whatever is going on in China's economy. You have the potential of a government shutdown. You have the UAW strike. There's a lot that they can't forecast at this point. So they're probably going to stay on hold and say they will remain vigilant against inflation, because that's about all they can do at the moment.
Very briefly, Mike, are any of these external forces that you talked about making the Fed's job easier? If you have people paying back student loans, they're not going out and spending as much money on other things.
Well, yes, but then that slows the other parts of the economy. We have seen people paying back student loans at a very fast rate for the last month, which is unusual because they didn't have to yet. So does that mean it's not going to be as big of an impact? That's one of the open questions.
Good question.
All right. Well, folks, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Our Michael McKee, Bloomberg News international economics and policy correspondent, getting ready for, it's like the Fed prom. How many proms a year?
I get out, well, there's 8 a year. I get out of New York City during UNGA week.
What do you mean you get out of it? Do you leave?
I'm going to Washington.
Oh, that's right.
To cover the Fed. Thank you,
all I'm
Jay
saying
Powell.
is careful
I don't
of the
get stuck in
subways
the
on the
traffic
way.
jams
This
that
is
you
why
guys are going to be stuck
Mike
in.
is a wise man.
I've spent
Always
much time
is.
already today getting stuck.
And our thanks to Dr. Ellen Wall, President of Transversal Consulting, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, a go-to when it comes to the energy markets.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and this update is brought to you by Glenmead. Glenmead offers sophisticated wealth and investment management solutions combined with a personalized service you deserve. Your wealth, your mission, your investments. Let's talk. Visit glenmead.com to learn more. We are now looking at a mixed market. We've got NASDAQ trading lower, little change, but lower by 3 points now. now, down less than 0.1%. The Dow also little changed, up 13 points right now. And as the S&P 500 index is up 1 point to 44.52. That is a gain of less than 0.1%. We are seeing small moves at the start of a busy week for major central banks, whose rate decisions will set the tone for global markets for the rest of the year. We do get the Fed decision on Wednesday. Brent crude, $94 a barrel, extending a powerful surge that has been driven by resilient demand and supply curves from OPEC Plus leaders, Saudi Arabia and Russia. Amrita Sen is the founder of Energy Aspects, and on Surveillance this morning, she discussed factors sending oil higher.
Yes, crude is getting all the headlines now. We're talking about it. But if you look at products and crack spreads, that have already been high for the last few months. Gasoline, diesel, they've been trading at $120+ per barrel. Crude was 80. Now crude's catching up, but those prices haven't necessarily gone up further.
The crack spread is the difference between the price of finished products and the cost of crude. You can hear more of the conversation with Amrita Sen on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Again, 10-year yield, 4.31% with a 2-year, 5.06%. Gold up 0.4%, 19.31 the ounce. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, we are, no doubt about it, living in interesting market times. Our John author is consistently keeping us informed about the hows and the whys, what we need to know. And in a column today, John notes the targets, they are changing. After
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go.
I was just going to say, after a rally that few of us anticipated and few analysts anticipated as well, Carol, the S&P 500.
Remember when the world was falling apart earlier this year?
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you're one of those analysts and, December of last year, maybe early January, you waited a few extra days just to see what things would be like. And, you said it's going to be 3250 on the S&P 500.
And then not so much, right?
Yeah,
we've definitely seen a lot of targets moving and basically moving up as the market has moved up. So let's get more on these moving market goalposts. We welcome in Bloomberg Market Senior Editor and Bloomberg Opinion columnist John Authors here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. You can read John's story and more from Bloomberg Opinion on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com/opinion. John, what a wacky year.
It has been
another wacky year, should I say?
Well, you don't. Maybe we live in interesting times, or something along those lines. In terms of years where there was a clear consensus, at least as to what the problem was or what the question was, this may be the most confusing in my career. It's not like, it's obviously not as scary as 2020. The issue is there's this pandemic. What the heck is it going to do to us?
Right.
Everybody knew the issue was credit in 2008. We just didn't know how bad it was going to be, how it was going to work out. Everybody knew .coms were overpriced, etc. Just again, how bad was it going to be? What was this time around? Nobody. There is a lack of agreement even on what the issue is.
Why is it that everybody's? And maybe I'm being a little naive and being like, John, tell me, because
well, he does run Hindsight Capital.
Right, that's true. I did leave that out.
Yeah, I think what this is one of the most weird points I've had made. This is from Savita Subramanian, but B of A, but various other people have made similar points. To some extent, the strength of the market this year owes something to that degree of confusion. If most people know what they don't know, most people would sensibly enough be pretty careful entering this year. It's not as, I was certainly advising them to be, so were plenty of other people. The fact that earnings may have done better than expected. We've had the artificial intelligence excitement.
Right.
But actual predictions for long-term growth have gone nowhere, and people are expecting rates to be higher for longer. And in a very strange way, that creates an opportunity for stocks to go up because it keeps this bottom line of if not pessimism, then a lack of excitement about long-term growth.
So I want to go back to what you said a little earlier.
Yes.
We just don't know, we can't identify what is the root cause of it. Is it just that we don't know yet?
In terms of where this
could
story...
we look back on this? Could we look back on this and say, you know what? AI was here to stay, but the run-up that was so widespread in companies that are tertiarily involved in AI wasn't warranted.
On AI, I imagine that's what's going to happen.
Okay.
And not just because I'm overplaying the lessons of living through the dot-com boom.
That's what I'm thinking too.
In the case of AI, unlike dot-com really was barely even conceivable until the World Wide Web, which was whenever it was, 93, I think, when it was first came online. AI has been around for decades. If you look in 2001 Space Odyssey, the fact that ChatGPT, which is an amazing app, but if you were paying attention, you knew that kind of thing was possible. And it's not as though ChatGPT in itself transforms people's profits around the world. The fact that ChatGPT had that kind of an impact, almost comparable to the arrival of the World Wide Web. It's not the World Wide Web versus AI. It's the World Wide Web, the ability to use the internet as a medium versus that one app, and that is very troublesome. So far, the chances are, as was the case in the dot-com boom, that the people who are really going to make money out of AI might not even be public yet.
But let me ask you, the way I see AI is, and I don't know, sometimes I think about it in a market where the labor market is tight. Is this a way for companies to create more productivity ultimately? And I agree that there's a lot of oh my God, it's going to change the world dramatically, but it will have an impact. And as you say, not new, companies have been using it, but this takes it to a whole other level.
That has a lot of truth to it, although again, it makes you worry about quite how this year unfolded the way it did. One of the more
if we didn't have it, would we not be doing? What would be the story if we didn't have that AI push?
We would just be talking about inflation more and more and more, which wouldn't be good for physical or mental health. Whereas AI is that much more that much more exciting. I think though this is perhaps the most startling bullish comment I heard on AI recently was from my compatriot Jeremy Grantham, who perhaps a little unfairly is known as a pretty serious bear,
right?
Which he hasn't been all his career, but he certainly is at the moment. He is concerned as a bear by AI. Not because he thinks, oh no, I've missed out on NVIDIA, but because what it can do is actually replace jobs that nobody really wants to do. It gets rid of the large swathes of clerical functions that really do offer the opportunity for companies to make more money, and will also create an interesting opportunity for those people who might now find something else to do. This is genuinely liberating technology that makes a difference to bottom lines and conceivably makes a difference to the economy. It saves people from doing boring jobs, providing they can find something else to do, providing the profits can be moved in that way. That's very, very exciting. Now, that's not at all the way in which people are excited by AI at present, but it is a reason why somebody who is thoroughly bearish like Jeremy Grantham is nervous that actually the potential for growth in profits in the economy is stronger than he's been assuming.
There are some real things to be nervous about as we get toward the end of the year, John. There's a big old strike.
Yes.
Okay. Oil prices are going up. Student loan repayments are starting. I'm just going through the list that Mike McKee gave us a few minutes ago.
There is this war going on in continental Europe.
That wall of worry. Come on.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'm a fine one to say this because I tend to look on the negative side of things. There's always a reason. There are always plenty of reasons to be nervous about investing in the market. The idea that we're going to do away with sin, do away with bad things, and just enjoy ourselves, that's ain't happening. Just isn't. Sorry. So there is that element there. What I do think is fascinating, particularly about the strike, and this is going back very much further to a childhood in pre-Thatcher Britain, where there was a strike on the news every night, and that was the classic occasion of a large capitalist economy finally seeing that union power had gone too far. Yeah, it's really interesting that this is a different kind of strike against with almost macroeconomic aims against all three of the big manufacturers. That is different from what we've seen before, and logically, if you're worried about inequality, if you're worried about the strength of labour coming out of a strong labour market, that's exactly what you would be concerned might happen. So let's see. I agree, that's very important.
TBD. I also think it's interesting, and it's in your story about, the way that higher interest rates haven't bitten as hard as expected. Like, it's kind of shocking. There's a lot in John's column. Highly recommend that you check it out. And John, we really appreciate it. Bloomberg Markets senior editor and Bloomberg Opinion columnist John Authers. You can find it at bloomberg.com/opinion. John, thanks.
Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. Nancy Lyons is in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. 5 Americans are leaving years of captivity behind them. They've been imprisoned in Iran, but were released today as part of a prisoner swap that will also return 5 Iranians to Tehran. The deal also gives Tehran access to $6 billion of its own oil revenue that the U.S. had frozen through sanctions. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was happy to share good news for a change.
It means that husbands and wives, fathers and children, grandparents can hug each other again, can see each other again, can be with each other again.
Secretary of State Blinken says today's release follows months of negotiations. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is among the many leaders heading to New York for this week's UN General Assembly meeting. On his way, he stopped in Silicon Valley for a chat with Elon Musk that was streamed on X, the social media platform originally known as Twitter. Bloomberg News Tel Aviv bureau chief Ethan Bronner says much of the discussion centered on artificial intelligence.
They both spent a fair amount of time talking about why it can really change the way we live in good and bad ways, and how to control the bad ways and take advantage of the good ways. It's also true that each man has had a fair amount of criticism in recent months, and in a certain way, each used the encounter to sort of fend off that criticism.
Bloomberg's Ethan Bronner. Hunter Biden is suing the IRS. The son of President Biden alleges IRS agents illegally disclosed his tax return information. The allegations center on disclosures made by 2 IRS agents during TV interviews and testimony before Congress. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries.
Facts, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Earlier gains have disappeared. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ are now all in the red. Let's head right over to the First Word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. U.S. stocks are a little change right now in a choppy session with the Dow currently down 6 points. S&Ps are down a point, and NASDAQ is off by 17. The U.S. 10-year yield 4.31%. Gold is up 8. Oil is climbing, and Bitcoin is higher by 1.1%. That's off the best levels of 3.7%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were energy and tech. Consumer discretionary led to the downside, and leaders to the upside in the Dow, Apple and Visa, while Walgreens and Boeing led to the downside. In other news, after the Wall Street Journal reported that Tesla and Saudi Arabia were in early talks for an EV factory, Elon Musk later disputed that story. And wrapping things up, Clorox fell after saying a cyber attack will weigh on the quarter. Live from the First Breaking News Desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney. And to hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type squawk, SQUA on your Bloomberg terminal. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's
the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we've got just about 18 minutes left in today's trading session, and I don't know, can I say what John Arthur said?
Yeah, say it.
There? He said it's kind of boring. You know, we're kind of waiting
was that
for
on
what...
air that he said that, or was it?
I don't
No, I think it
remember.
was during one of the breaks.
Sorry, John.
That's okay.
No, but it's like, it makes sense.
I mean, hurry up and wait for Wednesday, right?
Exactly. And we often talk about that. And we're definitely seeing it in the equity trade. Just, I mean, call it pretty much unchanged on the major equity averages. You know, continuing to keep a watch, certainly on the Treasury trade. And Charlie just, breaking down some of the numbers. What's our 2-year note right now at 5.05 and our 10-year note at 4.31. So definitely have seen yields moving up a little bit. But let's talk a little bit about the markets.
Yeah, we got Thomas Martin with us, Senior Portfolio Manager at the Registered Investment Advisor, Globalt Investment, with us on Zoom from Atlanta. Good to have you with us, Thomas. How are you?
I'm good. Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Sir, Carol and I correct in our assessment of today's trade? Hurry up and wait for the Fed?
You know, I don't really know what they're waiting for. Everybody knows what the Fed's going to do. It's almost 100% probability.
I think it's a summary of economic projections, right?
Right.
Well, don't you wonder about, what will Jay Powell decide to stress in his often brief statement, but then in the Q&A? What will be the thing that he kind of goes back to again and again? Is it data dependent? Is it, what is it that he continues to turn to? What is it that you think he might or that you're watching out for?
Yeah, well, he always seems to stress that without getting inflation right, nothing's going to be right in the economy. And I don't know that he said that the last time that he was on, but he's sure to say that frequently, along with data dependence for what they're going to do. And he wants, I think, to deliver the message that it's just very important to keep the pressure on inflation. And, as they say, the work is not done yet. We still have more to do. So they may hold, but, I think the message is going to be higher for longer.
So what's the dot plot going to show us?
We're looking for the dot plot to continue to have one more rate increase in there before the end of the year. But, it's an amalgamation of 14 different dots, and it'll probably be pretty close to evenly split. And the markets are reflecting that as they discount, what's going to happen with rates in the future, about a 40% chance of another rate hike before the end of the year. So they want to keep the pressure on. They want to give the message that, they are not asleep at keeping inflation under control, but they also don't want to scare the markets too much by, over tightening or being overzealous.
Hey, Thomas, I know it's hard to make generalizations. You've got different clients and different investors, and they all have potentially kind of different goals, different missions, different timelines. Having said that, what's a good model portfolio right now?
Well, for most people, when they look at their total portfolio, it's as you said, it's some combination of shorter term needs and hopefully a lot of longer term needs. So the traditional 60-40, 70-30, 50-50, some kind of mix where you have substantial exposure to equities for the longer term, but also have some money that will weather the storm should something unexpected come up and equities take a dive. So it's always important to have a little bit of cash in the portfolio for those next 6 to 9 months to a year.
A little right now or a lot? Just a little?
We're overweight. So our standard weighting in a portfolio is 5% cash, which is, really not that much for somebody in case something, goes completely awry. But then you have other investments like fixed income that you want to have a little bit more of, so you can have 2-3 years worth of what your cash needs are in case, we have a prolonged downturn, which we're not expecting at all right now.
I was just going to say, what could be the cause of a prolonged downturn?
Well, it's those things that everybody's been worried about and that haven't come home to roost for years, really. So we had the pandemic and we had the great financial crisis. We worked our way through that. But the way we did that was through a lot of fiscal excess. And let's just call it what it is. There's a lot of government borrowing out there and a lot of money that was distributed. And the Fed's balance sheet is very large. Those things all need to come down, especially when interest rates are not 0, but 5%. That interest cost on that debt is what we're all waiting for, whether it's the U.S. or corporations or banks or whatnot, is that prolonged stress of having to make these higher interest payments.
Well, in terms of the rate environment, which is so important in terms of how we value things and just kind of our outlook, what it costs us, whether it's, corporate debt, whether it's individual debt, do you think we stay on that 10-year, we stay above 4% easily for a while?
It makes sense to me that we do. The reason for going below that is probably an unpleasant reason, because something did go wrong and all of a sudden the 18 to 24 month lag starts kicking in, and there's no pricing power for companies anymore, and consumers pull in their horns. They can't spend. They don't have the money. They have too much debt. The student loan payments are coming due, and then unemployment goes up, and that sort of starts to spiral. And then the Fed says, "Oh my goodness, higher for longer. Longer has come, and we need to start lowering rates." But to the extent that the economy is as resilient as it has been, and that the employment situation stays good,
right?
A normalized level of rates is in between 4 and 5% for the 10-year.
I love that you said that. I mean, it's
welcome to the new old normal.
I used to exactly.
Yeah, right.
But I remember I worked with a colleague years ago, and he'd be like, "Listen, I remember my mortgage. He's a little bit older. Sorry, Mike. Not Mike McKee though. Different Mike. Not here anymore. But anyway, he would say my mortgage rate. He was paying a 15 or 16% mortgage rate. So like, folks,
you gotta refi if you had a 15. Or
he couldn't though. I think he eventually did. 30 seconds left, Thomas. You do have a positive bias towards equities for now. Is there a particular sector or sectors, just quickly?
Well, we still like large cap and we still like growth. And,
large cap or mega cap?
Well, mega cap is a big part of the large cap. But mega cap's up 37% year to date. And that's why we're seeing some of these names just have some of the air let out of them. NVIDIA, month to date down 15%. but that stock was on an absolute tear. So we're going to see some real consolidation here, some real opportunities for people to gain exposure to these. But these are the generals. They're the ones that let us in. They're going to be the ones who lead us out.
And even if you see somewhat of a correction, NVIDIA is still up, 200% this year. So like you say, perspective. Thomas Martin, thank you so much. Senior Portfolio Manager at the RIA Global Investment, joining us on Zoom in Atlanta. Perspective.
Yeah, we got to keep perspective.
We should write a book, Perspective.
Okay.
All right. Let's
Co-author.
Exactly.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Sources tell Bloomberg Amazon is hiring Microsoft's product chief to run the division responsible for Alexa and the Echo smart speakers. Panos Panay, who led Microsoft's Windows team and was central to the company's hardware push with its Surface computers, today said he was leaving Microsoft. Now, Amazon will be holding its annual New Devices event on Wednesday at its growing campus in Arlington, Virginia. Amazon down now by 0.6%, Microsoft down by 0.7%. Over the weekend, UAW President Shawn Fain rejected an offer of a 21% pay raise from Stellantis. David Welch is Bloomberg's Detroit bureau chief, and on surveillance this morning, he talked about the U.S. auto industry and the labor cost background.
There is concern about being competitive with Tesla, with being competitive with Japanese, Korean factories.
At the end of the day, though, for automaking laborers, it's well under 10% of costs comes from labor. And if you boost wages up by 5% a year, it's not like suddenly every vehicle loses money. It cuts into what have been record profits, but it's not something that devastates them.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Ford shares down now by just about 2.4%. GM down 1.8%. Stellantis down by 1.5%. And those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletan. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, just about 4.5 minutes left in today's trading session. In just a few minutes, we're going to head over to Romaine and Scarlett, talk to our TV colleagues, and count you down to the close on this Monday. In the meantime, what's on your radar, kiddo?
I'm looking at a story about Citi. We covered this last week, Carol, when we heard from our own team that there was a restructuring going on at Citi. That was Thursday. We're learning more now about what exactly that's going to look like. Jenny Serrain out with a story that says Citi is going to eliminate layers of management focused on specific regions. This is part of CEO Jane Fraser's biggest restructuring, Carol, in at least 2 decades.
Yeah, apparently this whole move is meant to bring the organizational structure in line with the firm's long-term strategy. David Livingstone, who was named the firm's chief client officer as part of the changes, said in an interview with Bloomberg TV today. If you want to listen to that whole interview, just check it out at Bloomberg.com. Livingstone, by the way, was previously CEO of Citigroup's businesses in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. We started with the need to simplify our structure and our management routines, and therefore the job cuts are the output. There is my former role as the chief executive of Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. That layer, the Asia-Pacific layer, and so on, they are being taken from the organization. You do think, I do feel like in some way the world is kind of taking a step back and looking and streamlining and trying to make more sense of their organizations.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that's exactly what's being reflected from Citi right now. So Citi's now going to operate in 5 main businesses that each report directly to Fraser. That eliminates the 3 regional chief roles that oversaw operations in about 160 countries around the world. It's looking to get rid of bureaucracy. The bank has said it's going to evaluate the tens of thousands of workers it has dedicated to back office functions such as finance, human resources, operations, and tech, whose roles were tied to a certain region.
And I look at no, big investment Wall Street bank is apples to apples, but we do tend to lump them together and compare them. I mean, I'm looking at Citigroup shares. They're down about 6% this year. JP Morgan, in contrast, up about 11%. So, again, there are different strengths in each business and what moves the financial needle, but you do wonder if maybe Citi's like, how do we maybe do things more efficiently?
Last week, the benchmark, Carol, when this news came out, was how the stock is done under Fraser and how it's underperformed every other big bank and all its peers during that tenure.
It's a benchmark, right, of measuring, but it's one that investors look at big time.
And, to be fair, we're only a couple years into her tenure at this point, but investors are maybe getting a little impatient.
Yeah, it's like clock is ticking. Speaking of clocks ticking, it is definitely on the close right now. Folks, just a few minutes left. We're going to head over to our TV colleagues Beyond the Bell. It starts right now.
Beyond the Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostick alongside Scarlett Fu. We're counting you down to the closing bell. And here to help take us beyond the bell, it's a global simulcast with our friends Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek. Welcome to our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms on a Monday afternoon, Carol Masser, where the markets, at least in the equity space, don't seem to be doing much of anything.
Ho-hum, it's like we've got a Fed meeting. Oh, wait, we do on Wednesday. Yeah, it does really feel like we're marking time a little bit until we get kind of an update. Not necessarily, we all expect the Fed to stand down in terms of any kind of moves on interest rates, but nonetheless, it does feel like a little wait and see as we get as we get an update on the economic projections. Having said that, energy definitely stand out. We talked about it last time. Energy names are the outperformers in today's trade. This says I'm looking at Brent right now at 94.53, so definitely moving up almost at 95 today. We saw it get very close.
Okay, back to the Fed because they're meeting this week, and that's what everybody is waiting for. The summary of economic projections. Bloomberg Economics, Scarlett, is saying we're likely going to see that the median participant sees one more rate hike in 2023. The question is, when's it going to happen, of course, and is it going to be, what's it going to look like in terms of the next year or two? We just spoke earlier to our Drive to the Close guest who actually mentioned about 10-year yields, and he was basically like, you know what? We're at a normalized level of rates right now. If you go back in history,
right?
Yeah, he was like perspective here. This is Thomas Martin, Senior Portfolio Manager at Globalt Investments, and he was like 4 to 5% on the 10-year. Kind of makes sense.
Yeah, a lot of people have been talking about that, particularly when you overlay it with the latest CPI data that we have. Maybe this is the restrictive territory. Maybe that's where we stay. The big question is, can the market handle it? Not much going on today in the price action, unchanged relatively across the board, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average higher by roughly 5 points as we wait for these numbers to settle. The S&P higher by about 3 points, and the NASDAQ only higher by 2. The Russell 2000, that is your relative underperformer on the day, down about 13 points or 0.7%.
Yeah, looking at the S&P 500, really kind of an even split. It's like investors are, again,
you didn't even need to show up to work today, Carol. You could have taken another day.
Hey, now you tell me. What's up with that, buddy?
All right, when you look at volume, no surprise, I guess, that it's about 22% below the year-to-date average. So we are marking time, as Carol put it. Let's take a look at the sector performances here. On the upside, you've got tech hardware. That's really Apple leading the way. Insurance companies and energy as oil prices continue to move higher, making fresh 15-month highs. On the downside, Tesla dragging down the auto companies by more than 3%. Of course, GM and Ford also in the red. Real estate investment trusts and telecom services all down by about 0.8%.
All right, so let's get to some of the individual gainers. Apple was top among the names in the S&P 500 and NASDAQ 100 today, finishing with a gain of about 1.7%. At its highs was up as much as 2.5%. Mega caps, we did see in some of our write-throughs, kind of leading among the gainers today. Analyst commentary today, though, on Apple, focusing on pre-orders for Apple's latest iPhone. I'm going to need one. My husband's going to need one. I don't know about you guys. Anyway, there's a bit of a debate as firms note a preference for more expensive models, but see mixed prospects for the stock. So basically, analysts are trying to kind of...
Do you not have a phone now? Is that...
She has the first Apple Watch, guys.
No, I have the second Apple Watch.
I'm not kidding.
I'm
not kidding at all.
Some might say that's
barely
vintage.
even tells the time.
Apple shares, by the way, are coming off 2 straight weekly declines, still up nearly 40% year to date, so not too shabby. DoorDash, I think you were talking about this earlier on TV, Romaine.
We were, yeah.
Okay, see, I do listen. Mizuho. Say it again.
Mizuho.
This is what happens.
Yeah.
I forget Bloomberg passwords. I can't speak anymore when I'm away for 2 weeks. Upgrading the food delivery
drinking on the job does that.
No, I'm not. Water only. Upgrading the food delivery company to buy from neutral. The analyst over there, James Lee, says his confidence that growth and gross order value should outperform guidance and street expectations in the second half of 2023. Price target to 105 from 90. What are we closed today?
Don't look, Carol. Just don't look.
Where's my?
It's in the red.
I can't
but
see.
just barely.
80.92 is where we closed. And then Team Atlassian, top of the NASDAQ 100 today. Again, Mizuho reiterating its buy rating at $240 price target. Did I get it right?
No, but keep going.
After having learned that the company has announced a series of price increases to the cloud versions of flagship products, stock is up about 61% year to date. It's like being around my family, my 4 brothers, my 2 sisters.
That's
this
a compliment.
Is what it's like. It is a
That's
compliment. I love.
Let's get to some of the gainers on the day. Scarlett talked about the autos and components up there. Tesla among the best performers in
Did
there.
you say gainers or decliners?
Did I say gainers?
See, I'm rubbing off.
See, I was doing gainers last week when you were gone. All right, let's talk decliners. Tesla finishing the day down by 3.3%. That EV price war that we've talked about quite a bit over the last few months, it's got at least one analyst concerned. We got Mark Delaney over at Goldman Sachs lowering his 2023 and 2024 profit estimates for the company. Delaney citing lower average selling prices and auto gross margin. He said that Tesla could further lower prices in 2024 to support higher volumes. We've seen the company have a pattern of doing that. That would offset any EPS benefit from a reduction in costs. Let's take a look at Moderna. Shares of COVID vaccine makers falling on the day today. This after Pfizer came out earlier today and actually gave a prediction about how many people are going to get that COVID vaccine. They said that 24% of the U.S. population that's recommended to take the COVID-19 shots is actually going to get them. It's actually better than last year. The bivalent booster saw uptake of only 17%. Still a slight increase from last year that's got investors concerned, though. Pfizer closing lower and Moderna closing down by more than 9%. And then ARM Holdings, worth taking a look at ARM. Shares down on the day today. This after Bernstein initiated coverage with an underperform rating. Bernstein actually suggesting it might not be the beneficiary of AI that some investors may have expected. The company finished the day in the red today as well.
Hey, wait, you guys changed the boards while I was away. Thanks for the memo.
Sure, Carol. We do a lot while you're away because, when Carol's away, we're like, oh, wow, we can do all this stuff that Carol blocks us on.
Moving along.
Anyway, I just want a quick check on yields today here. And we should point out that the price action in the Treasury space was really not any more exciting than the price action in the equity space. Most of the activity on the longer end of the curve. So we did see a little bit of a cheapening there. Now your 2-year yield up about 3 basis points to about 5.06 and change. Everything else across the curve more or less was richer here. But this gets to the idea of that holding pattern, Scarlett, as we wait, of course, for that 2-day Fed meeting that begins tomorrow, and of course the big decision at 2 p.m. on Wednesday.
But before that, we possibly get Instacart beginning to trade tomorrow as soon as they price their IPO right now. Romaine, we were reporting earlier that perhaps they're going to be IPOing at $30 a piece.
Yeah.
And of course, this comes on the heels of the ARM IPO, which was widely received well.
I'm actually probably more interested in how this IPO is received than ARM, because we kind of knew ARM was going to get a lot of attention, right? We knew that there were a lot of people scrambling to do that. Instacart seems like one of those stocks or one of those companies where it's not going to be as definitive. So you kind of wonder what the appetite is going to be for basically a grocery delivery.
It's not a mature company like ARM is either.
It's not, and it has less of a track record in terms of profitability. I know there's been a lot of talk about its ad business and how that becomes a little bit of a ballast. I think we can get rid of the yields that are on the screen there, but that becomes a little bit more of a ballast there. One interesting thing that I found that I learned today is, do you know what the name of this company is? It's not Instacart.
No.
It's called Maple Bear.
I did not know that.
I did not know that either.
I just keep thinking of the honey bear.
That is the formal name. That is the formal name of the company.
Evokes images of Vermont to me.
Yeah.
Oh, hey.
Yeah.
Hey, oh, wait, there are people here.
Yeah, Maple Bear.
Why is it Maple Bear?
I don't know, but the ticker is going to be.
I think that's a holding company name.
So you mean, okay, Romaine, so you find out Maple Bear?
I didn't. I literally found this out like 2 hours ago. I have to dig. I'm sure there's got to be a reason why they named it that. Maybe they started as Maple Bear and then somebody said, Instacart is maybe a little.
Instacart's pretty cool.
Yeah. You do raise a good point though, Romaine, about what it means for other companies that have been on the sidelines for years at this point.
Everybody's now tuning away and they're going to be Googling Maple Bear.
But the drought in IPOs that we've seen over the last 18 months has been, the biggest drought going back to the financial crisis. So, the big question is not how ARM did on its first day, but it's about how ARM does over the next month or so. It's about how Instacart does. It's about how Birkenstock does.
And just too, we should point out with ARM, and we kind of know that some of the price action was just distorted because there was such a small amount of shares that were actually made available to the public. That's not necessarily going to be the case with Instacart. We're going to have a much bigger float.
I'm just looking at the IPO ETF that tracks new issuances. It's gone from a low of $24 at the start of the year, now about $33, $32. So it's been holding up okay, even
That's
with the
what you
lack
were looking
of
up. Shouldn't you have been looking up what Maple Bear means?
That's what I'm doing.
That's the most important thing here.
That's
Scarlett.
exactly what I'm trying to do. Why Maple Bear?
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't you do that?
And we're going to get a lot of messages about this.
Well, what's interesting, though, I do think it is a really strong sign when you've got companies, right, ARM is in its whole other category, but if you have companies feeling comfortable enough to IPO in this market, you've got Birkenstock coming and a few others, it does say something about the strength of this environment, right? You're not going to do it if you feel like it's going to come apart.
It means no landing for the economy, right?
Birkenstock has been on the sidelines for 260 years, guys.
Birkenstock, I know. How about a mature company there?
Exactly.
All right, everybody who's listening and watching, please send us notes on Twitter.
Do we know who the
X.
founders are?
Who?
Some German brothers.
I don't know.
Yeah,
it sounds like that they were
brothers.
a technology company. I don't know.
Birkenstock?
No.
Oh.
Instacart, Maple Bear.
Oh, okay.
We're talking about two different companies here.
I think we should go now. Let Carol sort of get up to speed. We're going to try this again on Tuesday, and hopefully,
Try me on Friday. I might be up to
Friday.
speed by Friday. All right, guys, that is a wrap. Our cross-platform coverage, radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. We have fun. What can we say? The markets are fun. Beyond the Bell. We'll see you again tomorrow.
Okay. We got
about buying.
Yeah.
Paul Brennan, thank you so much. Our producer, man.
we don't have to look
Picking
too
out some
hard
music.
to look at the meaning behind why certain songs are chosen in certain places. We had a great team.
We do have a great team. We have an amazing team, and we love.
So
can you talk about business school?
Yeah, when I went to business school a few years ago, everybody wanted to work at the big three. That's where their classmates wanted to go. We're talking McKinsey, Deloitte, BCG. The ones who didn't go into consulting, they wanted to go to finance. There were some of my classmates who went to work at Tesla and Apple, but they were kind of few and far between. There were a couple entrepreneurs, but they were really, it was all about consulting. One thing I never heard throughout my time there was someone starting a so-called search fund, raising money to find, acquire, and then run a small business.
Well, the search fund is becoming a more common path for business school graduates. Who knew? Well, our Matt Boyle knew. It's called Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, or ETA. Matt is Senior Management Workplace Reporter here at Bloomberg News. He writes about it in the upcoming issue of Bloomberg Business Week magazine, which you can read now on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com/businessweek. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. What is this about?
Well, this is about...
How new is it?
It's not entirely new, but it was not very well known for many decades. It started all the way back in 1984 when a guy named Irv Grousbeck was basically just helping a couple of Harvard Business School MBAs who had sort of had a fledgling kernel of an idea. They didn't really know what to do with it. They knew they wanted to run a company, though. And so he helped them come up with this sort of investment vehicle, which was not even called the search fund then. I asked Irv, like, did you coin search fund? He said, no, I don't really think so. Irv's a great guy, by the way. But Irv then went from Harvard to Stanford Graduate School of Business and took the idea there. But for many years, it was just sort of a smattering. A handful of students would do this. People who didn't want to go the traditional corporate route, but who also didn't want to do the traditional startup route where you found your own company, you create your own company, in the proverbial garage, Hewlett Packard, et cetera. These are people who want to buy a company that already exists. It's already profitable. It's a small business. It's not going to cost $10, $15 million.
What kind of companies are we talking about?
Traditionally, we're talking about small local businesses, plumbing companies, pest control companies. But what's interesting, Tim, is that it's really evolved outside of that to now look at more like technology companies, B2B software companies. One guy I talked to said he's looking to buy a software company that automates insurance company billings. Very boring, but very profitable.
Go ahead, Carol.
Well, what I'm curious, go ahead.
I was going to say the hard part about buying a business is, right, it's a quote-unquote efficient market. So, you buy it based on, this is what they teach you at business school, right? You buy it based on future cash flows. So it has a valuation. So you have to bring something to this business that makes it more efficient.
Exactly.
You have to squeeze more money out of this business or improve it in some way. How are these guys doing that?
They're doing so by taking over a company that, let's say, was founded decades ago by a guy who's, a woman or a man who is now into his 60s, maybe looking to retire.
Like a family business.
Yeah, a family business, a passion business. These people are looking to just basically run them better, more efficiently, to bring the tools that you learn in business school to a business that maybe it's making money, but it probably could be making better margins. Maybe it's a bit bloated in payroll. Maybe it's not doing a good job in marketing. And so these MBAs apply what they've learned at Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Wharton, and they also work with investors. So you have advice coming from outside. So it's not just the ETA searcher who has to come up with every idea. They have help from investors who are putting their money into the business, and then they try to really grow it and then sell it eventually down the road.
It sounds very private equity-like, because I often...
It's almost like mini PE. It's mini PE.
It's exactly. Well, so that's what I was curious about, is where do they get the money, right? I mean, Tim graduates and he says, I want to do a search fund.
It depends. There's two ways you can do it. You can gather a group of investors who will fund you initially for about a couple of years, your admin costs, your travel costs, because it costs money to search around for these companies.
Right.
Or you can do what's called self-funded, where you are, funding it yourself. Let's say you've worked in corporate America for 10, 12 years. You have some savings. Maybe you have some money from your family. You might use that to plow into the search. And then when you're ready to buy the company, you take out an SBA-backed loan. Okay. So that's self-funded, or you can go through investors. And those investors, you might have a little less autonomy if you're going through investors, but you will have the advice and networking capabilities that those investors can bring.
So Matt, you got some data on how well these companies did post-acquisition.
Everything's a success, right?
Yeah, everything.
Not
100%.
So first off, not
Sarcasm.
every search leads to an acquisition. So that's the first thing. You might not find, sometimes it's needle in a haystack, and you might not even find a company to buy.
Yeah.
But those who do find a company to buy through a search fund, nearly 3 out of 4 who did an acquisition made a profit. And the tally, the number of annual exits, when you eventually sell your company, the ones that generated a positive return hit an all-time high recently. This is all data from Stanford, which has great tracking of search funds and how well they do. Also, who takes part in searches. This is traditionally a very bro-tastic type of sector, a lot of white guys. But it is getting more diverse, thankfully.
Yeah.
The number of women searchers has more than doubled, from 5% to 13%. We're seeing more Black and Hispanic searchers as well.
Is there certain MBA grads or MBA students who are doing this a lot? Like Stanford, that's the environment. Like they're either people
there
are
are
starting
certain
companies or
environments that are
investing
very
in it.
entrepreneurial. Stanford, Babson is also really a great home for entrepreneurs. I did talk to them. They're not in the story though. But this is really percolating outside of the sort of traditional entrepreneur hubs. I mean, any smart MBA who's just thinking, well, maybe the corporate life's not for me. I have an appetite for risk. I really just want to run a company. This could be for them.
Hey, talk more of the motivation here behind this and why, the corporate life post-pandemic might not be for some of these
we all
folks.
know what's going on with hiring at the big three, McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, and not really hiring as actively as they were. A lot of consulting and tech companies are pushing out start dates as well. Don't even get into the layoffs. So the hiring, entrepreneurism always gets a little bit more popular when the traditional hiring avenues slow down, Tim, but this is more than that. This is really like sort of this gospel of ETA is spreading. Go on Twitter for ETA Twitter or SMB Twitter, small, medium business. SMB Twitter is just really a fascinating little niche of Twitter.
I've done some poking around there. It shows up in my For You.
Exactly.
It
You
seems
got
like,
guys
it
talking.
Seems like you're the only one without a business.
Yes, exactly. Everyone's got a business. These brokers are all over the place. I'll find you the right business.
Then there's the lawyers too.
Yes,
who
there's
help
a whole
you with the
ecosystem.
deals. They have newsletters.
Yeah. But it's really fascinating.
Let's start something, man.
What do you want to buy?
I was just going to say, because I'm not a bro, so you two can do it.
No, not me. I'm the last guy.
Having said that, I am curious about the schools. Are they then, MBA schools, business schools, kind of adapting their curriculum?
They are.
because
They're
of this?
adding classes. Basically, Wharton now has 2 MBA classes for ETA and an undergrad class as well. I talked to the head of their entrepreneurship center there. He said alumni were screaming for ETA because there was no real, curriculum. But it's beyond that. Again, it's not just Wharton and Harvard and Stanford. Schools are adding not just classes, but also clubs, meet and greets, informal things where somebody who has bought a company will come back, talk to the MBAs and say, this is how I did it. This is what to avoid.
Cool.
Because again, this is not for everyone, but
Right.
there's also a lot of military veterans, people who are used to uncertainty and risk and are very good at leading people. So there's a lot of vets as well in ETA.
Yeah, love that.
There were a lot of vets in my class.
So don't you start talking about an ETA.
No, estimated time of arrival is the only ETA.
That's what I thought it stood for.
I've never heard of this, and
Yeah.
it's kind of wild that it's been around for a while.
Yeah, it's great.
When there's a story like this, I always think about our audience. We've only got about 30 seconds left or so. What do you think they need to understand about this or know about this?
They need, just knowing it's out there is good. Need to know that you can get advice. You don't have to do this on your own. There are people who've gone through this, who've done this, and whether this is former searchers or investors, academics, professors as well can help. So there is help out there. But again, this is something that you really do need an appetite for risk, and you really want to just sort of be in charge and take a business and turn it into something better.
I also wonder about valuations. Is it just another group that's bidding after companies, right? There's just so many people going after
The
companies.
big PE firms are now sort of horning in on some of these local businesses.
Yeah.
So there's more competition. So valuations are creeping up.
Who knew?
I didn't know.
Don't get any ideas there, buddy.
Then what do they do with it, right? Do they keep it? Do they go sell it to private
Spin it
equity?
off,
Spin it
They
off?
they usually will sell it. Who they sell it to? It's not a traditional LBO, so you're not just. The thing is they're running it. An LBO firm is not running usually what they buy. This is what I like about this. You're running it. You're making it better.
Matt Boyle, always love when you stop by. Senior Management Workplace Reporter right here at Bloomberg News. Matt, thanks.
Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 4:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Sources tell Bloomberg grocery delivery business Instacart is planning to sell shares in its IPO for $30 apiece and perhaps more. The San Francisco-based company is offering to sell 22 million shares, was offering to sell 22 million shares for between $28 and $30 each, a range it elevated on Friday. Instacart is in talks to price the shares today at the top end of that range. One of the sources says potentially higher at $31. Stocks managed to eke out a gain today. The S&P holding on to a 3-point gain to finish the session at 44.53, up less than 0.1%. Small moves at the start of a busy week. The Dow up 6 points today, also little changed, up less than 0.1%. Nasdaq higher by 2 points, also little changed. 10-year yield 4.30% with the 2-year 5.04%. Spot gold up $10 the ounce, up by about 0.5% to $19.34. Bitcoin up 1.3%, 26,792, and West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.4%, 92.02 a barrel. Stay with Bloomberg for the very latest on Instacart. We'll pass along any details as they become available. Again, recapping, stocks higher today. S&P up 3, a gain there of 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Massar along with Tim Stanovic live in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio, streaming on YouTube and, of course, on Bloomberg Originals. Well, as processors become larger and more complex, their ability to communicate with the rest of the computer is going to become a bit of a choke point. So says Intel researchers. And so glass-based substrates, which sit between the chip and connecting components, are the answer to this challenge. If I sound smart, that's only because I'm reading the words.
I was going to say, you
Ian
make
King.
it sound so easy and simple, Carol. You spent some time on the vacation designing chips?
That's what I did in my spare time. Let's get to Bloomberg's Ian King. He is Bloomberg News U.S. semiconductor and networking reporter. He writes about this and has been speaking, of course, with Intel about it. He's on Zoom from our San Francisco bureau. Ian, thank you so much for being with us. I was thinking about, after reading your story, the movie The Graduate, where they were like, it's all about plastics. Now we're talking about glass, at least maybe for the semi industry. What is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually moving away from plastics, from epoxy and fiberglass here. Basically, what you said. I mean, there's a potential choke point here as chips like NVIDIA's get, their best AI processors get larger and larger. Lots and lots of circuits, lots and lots of elements that need to communicate with the computer, the rest of the computer, and to facilitate those connections and to keep those chips fed with power and information, you need a better way of connecting them with the computer, is the argument that Intel is making. Absent that, we're going to actually reach a limit, which isn't a chip limit, it's actually a packaging limit. And this is something that Intel is arguing that we haven't really thought about and perhaps we should be thinking about.
Go ahead, Carol.
When you say packaging limit, what do you mean? How much can actually be put on a chip, or what does it mean?
The size of the chip is going up, the number of transistors on the chip, the number of circuits, that's going up. That's kind of the given. That's what the industry does. But by doing that, we're actually creating a potential roadblock, which is the ability of that chip to communicate with the rest of the processor. Because if you've ever looked at a chip up close, you see a package, you see all of these little dots, basically copper dots, and these are the connections that carry power information from the rest of the computer to the chip itself. The more dots you put there, the more unstable that package becomes. If the package becomes unstable, then you don't get as good a connection. All of these problems start to occur, the more connections that you need, and therefore you need a material that can support more of these connections. It's kind of analogous to having a USB-C port that reaches its limits, can't carry as much power, can't carry as much data. So we need a better one with more channels. That's kind of what's going on here.
So Ian, tell us about Intel's glass and what makes Intel's glass special. Where do they get it? How do they make it?
Yeah, this is something that's been in academic research for arguably a decade or longer. It's not a particular type of glass that Intel has that's unique, but it's the ability to have that, because glass is obviously brittle, right? So you don't want it snapping, essentially. So it's being able to sort of manufacture it in a process that makes it still strong and still stable and still flat, but putting lots of holes in it. Obviously, the more holes you put in a substance, the weaker you make it. But we want lots of holes here because we want lots of connections, and you have to make these holes really, really small. So it's not so much the glass itself, although that is important. It's the way that you can process it, the way that you can kind of drill these tiny holes with lasers and then coat that with metals and have those connections.
Have we not needed something with this capability before? Is it just because of the way things are getting more complicated, AI, for instance, and so on? Is that why there's a demand at this point?
That's what Intel is saying. They're saying, look, this ceramics technology that we had a couple of decades ago was great, and then we decided to go to something cheaper, which was this epoxy and fiberglass, and that worked pretty well up until now. But as we're getting chips that have gone from 1 or 2 billion transistors to 10, 20, 30 billion transistors, that's a lot of circuitry, that's a lot of connections that you need. And because epoxy and fiberglass is inherently flexible, which used to be one of its strengths, you drill too many holes in it, it becomes weak, you lose the connection. So now you need a new material to support that density of connections.
Are other people also working with glass or talking about it? I'm just curious if this is just an Intel thing.
Yeah, I mean, Intel obviously are keen to be like, hey, look, we're the greatest, we've got the best technology in the world, as you would expect, or else they wouldn't have shown me.
Right.
Other companies are working
and look
on
what
it.
we got.
Exactly, yeah, but they're not going to show me their bad stuff, are they, right? So, yes, as far as we understand, other companies are working on that. But if you talk to Intel researchers, they say, look, we are further down the line with this. And the most important thing, as with a lot of semiconductor production, it's not, hey, we can do one of these or two of these on a bench somewhere, aren't we great? It's, can we do this millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of times in factories in a replicable way that's stable and cost effective? At the moment, this technique is expensive, right? It hasn't been proven. They are still working on that, still trying to bring that price down, still trying to bring those techniques to the point where it's comparable to what we're doing now. So that's a TBD.
How does this development, how does what they're doing technologically with glass, the innovations that they've made, fit into Intel's turnaround?
Yeah, no, that's, I think, the crux of the matter here. This glass effort is part of something that they call advanced packaging, which is lots of different techniques where you can combine different chips on the same package. You can stack them, you can connect them together in a planar way. Intel says, look, we can do this better than anybody else. Intel is now, as you know, opening its factories to everybody else. It wants people to look at its technology and say, hey, wow, we need Intel. At the moment, if you compare their basic transistor technology to that of TSMC. TSMC is ahead. So in theory, there is no reason to go to Intel, right? It's great, you got nice factories, but we can get better stuff from TSMC. That's in theory the situation. What Intel is doing with this packaging is saying, hey, bring your chips from TSMC, from Samsung or anywhere. We'll package them for you. And that's a way of kind of getting their sort of foot through the door with some of these competitors and customers that they want to bring in for their efforts down the road.
Intel, Ian, rather, as someone who's watched this industry, the semiconductor industry, for a long time and seen the different cycles and seen the different developments, I do wonder, is this kind of akin to, do you remember the 60 Minutes piece? Was it Jeff Bezos? And there were lots of questions. Was it about profitability? It was, or something. And then
he was like, hey, look at my drone.
And then he said, hey, look at my drone.
That was 10 years ago. Isn't that crazy?
It's 10 years ago.
And guess what? I'm still getting my packages from a guy who drives sometimes he's on a bike.
But it's a very profitable company.
It's not a drone.
So even though maybe there was a diversion, but is this kind of a like, how do you parse through? Yeah,
no, I know what you're asking. And you're absolutely right in that the transition that Intel is going through is very expensive, right? Gelsinger has made literally tens of billions of dollars worth of bets that this business will change, right? That he can break into the foundry business. He can bring people into these factories that he's building. Because if he can't, it's a disaster, right? This could, really cripple this company going forward. I would say that this is what we're talking about in this terms of advanced packaging is like, hey, you sell what you've got right now, right? And then hope that you can build that customer relationship, because Intel has never had these relationships. It's been very much, hey, this is the way we do things in-house. Now it's got to have this, hey, we can do what you want us to do kind of approach. And this is a way of kind of fostering that kind of new image and that new approach for Intel, something, frankly, that they've found really difficult in the past. And this is part of, it's almost like an image-changing exercise as much as anything else, although obviously technology is very, very important in the chip industry. That's what's going on, I think.
Oh, well, and also something that's going on is tech conferences up the wazoo, pretty much. I mean, you got Apple last week, you got this week Intel's. How do you fit this into what Intel's going to announce this week, and what else do you expect to hear from Intel in the context of its turnaround and also what it has on the agenda for the remainder of the year and next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you saw with the ARM IPO, and you've seen a lot of these conferences, all anybody wants to hear about from a company like Intel is, what's your AI play? How are you going to win? How are you going to make up some ground on NVIDIA? How are you going to show us that you can do something different? So I think the way to look at what Intel is going to do this week will be like, what can they tell us that we don't already know? What can they tell us that changes the narrative and makes people start to believe that they do have a play in this rapidly expanding world that we're seeing, that at the moment it's all going to NVIDIA. And so people are really looking for them to change that narrative, and we'll see whether they can do that or not.
Well, we'll be looking forward to your commentary on that meeting and anything that Mr. Gelsinger has to say. Hey, listen, Ian, thank you so much, as always. Bloomberg's Ian King. He's Bloomberg News U.S. semiconductor and networking reporter. Find him on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, at Ian M. King.
Well, let's go ahead and check on the latest world and national news. Nancy Lyons is in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. 5 Americans are on their way home as part of a prisoner swap that will return 5 Iranians to Tehran that have been held in the U.S. The deal also allows Iran to access $6 billion of its oil money that was frozen due to sanctions. Speaker Kevin McCarthy is making it clear he does not want the government to shut down on the Republicans' watch, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. Over the weekend, a deal was reached by House Republicans on a continuing resolution, or CR, that would keep the government running in the short term.
McCarthy's been trying to bring his rebel faction into line, but it's not working, Greg Valliere, political analyst for AGF Investment, said in a Bloomberg interview.
He's on really thin ice. I don't think he can get a deal before the October 1 deadline. These people are on a different planet from you and me, so we do have a shutdown. We're not going to kill Social Security and Medicare benefits, but if you want to go to a national park, you're out of luck.
It could be well into the holiday season, Valliere said, before the issue is resolved. In Washington, Irv Chapman, Bloomberg Radio.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will be holding meetings and lobbying for more financial support this week as world leaders gathered at the United Nations. He'll also be bringing his message to Washington, where he'll push lawmakers to approve an additional $24 billion in aid that's been proposed by President Biden. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern says it'll be a tough sell for Zelensky.
How does he convince Republican lawmakers that at the moment are still unnerved and concerned about sending more taxpayer dollars to Ukraine, that they should pass that bill? Remember, the U.S. administration, the White House, asked for in a supplemental spending bill more Ukraine aid, and that Ukraine aid was missing from that CR that the Republicans were discussing last night in a phone call.
Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 4:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and sources tell Bloomberg the grocery delivery business Instacart is planning to sell shares in its IPO for $30 a piece, perhaps more. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, they all eked out a small gain today as investors await Wednesday's rate decision from the Fed. S&P today up 3 points, a little changed, up by about 0.1%. The Dow up 6 points, also little changed, up by less than 0.1%. NASDAQ virtually flat on the day, up by 2 points to 13,710. 10-year yield 4.30% with the 2-year 5.05%. Spot gold today up 0.5%, 1933 the ounce. Bitcoin up 1.1%, 26,754. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.7%, 92.34 barrel on WTI. Barrel of Brent 94.69, up by 0.8%. Wall Street is looking ahead to Wednesday's Fed decision and the statement from Fed Chair Jay Powell. So what to expect from Powell in the statement and at the news conference? Thomas Martin is Senior Portfolio Manager at Globalt Investments, and he was a guest right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
He wants, I think, to deliver the message that it's just very important to keep the pressure on inflation. And, as they say, the work is not done yet. We still have more to do. So they may hold, but, I think the message is going to be higher for longer.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Bloomberg Business Week podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Amazon is hiring Microsoft's product chief to run the division responsible for the voice-activated Alexa assistant and Echo smart speakers. This, according to sources. Microsoft down 0.4% today. Amazon also lower by just about 0.4%. Recapping, stocks higher, little changed. S&P up 3 points, up by about 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much for that update. Charlie Pellet with a Bloomberg Business News Flash. This is Carol Master along with Tim Stenovic live here on Bloomberg Business Week. There's a lot going on. We talk about the traffic because it's the annual gathering of the UN General Assembly. And
are these all EVs, Carol, that are snarling traffic?
I'm not sure they are. Probably a lot aren't. And, the UN has 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and that includes one about ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And this is at a point where many people, almost 700 million, still live in the dark. But we're making changes. We're trying to make it improvements.
Yeah, that's the bad news. There's some good news, though. Modern renewables power nearly 30% of electricity, but remain low when it comes to heating and when it comes to transportation. With more on global renewable energy and everything happening in the space, very pleased to have with us Sumant Sinha, founder, chairman, and CEO of the nearly $2.3 billion renewable energy company Renew. It trades in the U.S. as an ADR under the ticker RNW. Sumant joins us on Zoom from New York City. Sumant, how are you?
I'm good. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, we're doing pretty well. I mean, whenever we hear about renewables, talk about renewables, what comes up over and over again is storage. It's great during the day when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing and when the rivers are running. But how do you store all that energy for when it becomes dark?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Renewables are intermittent. But I think what's happened is that over the last few years, technology has evolved so rapidly that renewables have become really, really cheap. And what that means is that there's enough room for us now to have battery-based storage or pumped hydro-based storage to come in to actually help balance all this intermittent renewable energy capacity. And what we've done in India is we've pioneered a very interesting kind of a technological solution where we're actually able to, using only renewables, wind and solar, we're able to give solutions that are almost semi-firm power. And in that, we use very little amounts of storage, mostly batteries, but essentially combine the wind and solar together in such a way that we then put into the grid power that is 80 to 85% firm. And we are able to do this at a price which is still significantly cheaper than, let's say, coal-based power, which is the alternative in a lot of emerging markets, including in India. And so I think that this is possible because, of course, renewables have become so cheap, because the cost of storage has also come down, because we can technically find solutions that are quite attractive. So I think this is really the direction the market is evolving in, and eventually will allow us to replace fossil fuels almost entirely in the grid.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Spending some time out on the water, and I came into the wind farms that are out off of some of the islands, off of the East Coast here in the United States, and I was kind of like, wow, like it was really interesting to see it at work. What is the most productive and efficient renewable energy? Is it solar? Is it hydro? Help me understand really what makes the most sense. And is it different for the developing world versus the developed world, where there is the old infrastructure for fossil-based fuels very entrenched?
Yeah, so you know what happens is it really depends on the natural resource in a specific area. So for example, in certain countries which have cheap land, or let's say lots of desert area, solar radiation is very good. In those countries or in those areas, perhaps solar becomes really, really cheap. In other geographies where, let's say, the wind is blowing, for example, in the Midwest of the US, wind speeds are very good. And so in those areas, having wind is a lot cheaper than solar. So it really depends. It also depends a little bit on the transmission infrastructure, because if you have to carry all that power away into other areas where that power is required, then the cost of transmission also becomes a factor. Right. So it really depends on different areas. I would say that in general, however, offshore wind is more expensive than onshore wind or onshore solar. The only way it makes sense for offshore wind turbines is in case land prices are very expensive, or if people have this concept of NIMBY, not in my backyard, and therefore they want the wind farms to be far away from them. In those scenarios, having offshore wind turbines is, makes sense. But in most geographies, onshore wind and onshore solar are cheaper by far. So it really depends. Now, hydro, to the extent you already have built a dam or something a long time back, then the variable cost of running a hydro plant is very low. But otherwise, building a new hydro plant can be quite expensive. And the same applies to nuclear power as well. So today, I would say in most countries, solar is the cheapest. And in some countries, wind might be cheaper than that. But usually, it's a pretty close run thing between the two.
Well, Carol mentioned in her introduction, that more than 600 million people around the world live in the dark. Take us to what your company is doing in India and how it's helping to facilitate the energy transition there, because we know that's a country that is among the, when it comes to global CO2 emissions, it's at the top of worst polluters.
Yeah, that's right. Look, and India is the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide now in the world, accounting for about 7 to 8% of all carbon emissions. And India just is at the beginning of its development cycle in a way. And over the next 20 to 30 years, we might grow 4 or 5 times of where we are. Now, if we grow in a way that has been as carbon intensive as every other country's growth, then you can imagine that carbon emissions are going to go up dramatically. So I think it's actually very, very heartening that the Indian government has taken a very strong view that we want to grow in a fundamentally different way, and that the whole energy transition, moving from fossil fuels, which are carbon intensive, to clean energy, which is non-carbon intensive, is actually a very strong decision that the government has taken. And is an area where India can actually, by developing local industries, can actually become a global leader. And so that's the direction that we're likely to go in. Now, what that means is that India's power demand is growing at about 6 to 7% every year. We have to add almost 50 to 60,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity every year. Now, to give you a sense, that's almost a quarter of the total amount of renewable energy that is getting added every year all over the world. Right. So that's how much we have to add in India every year to make sure that we meet just the future demand growth from renewable energy sources.
Forgive us, we have to break in, but Sumant, come back soon. I'd love to continue. Both of us would love to continue this conversation with you. Sumant Sinha, founder, chairman, and CEO of Renew, trades in the U.S. as an ADR under RNW. We thank him for his time.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Brent crude oil is nearing $95 a barrel, $94.70 right now, highlighting inflationary pressures just as policymakers prepare for interest rate decisions on Wednesday with the Federal Reserve in the U.S. But what about Brent crude heading to $100 a barrel? That question this morning for Chevron CEO Mike Wirth, who was interviewed earlier today on Bloomberg Markets.
Sure looks like it. We're certainly moving in that direction. The momentum, supply is tightening. Inventories are drawing. These things happen gradually. You can see it building. And so I think the trends would suggest that we're certainly on our way. We're getting close.
Clorox is warning a cyber attack it had originally reported last month will have a material impact on its earnings. Clorox shares today did decline by 2.4%. U.S. homebuilder sentiment fell to a 5-month low in September as higher mortgage rates continue to push many prospective buyers out of the market. The National Association of Home Builders Wells Fargo gauge declined 5 points to 45 after sliding 6 points a month earlier. That marked the largest back-to-back decrease in nearly a year. Nexstar Media Group and satellite TV provider DirecTV have reached a new multi-year distribution agreement covering 176 of Nexstar's local TV stations and its cable news network. And those are our top company stories at this hour. And this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. Tim Stenevec and Carol Masser. She is back live from the Bloomberg
Wanting an ice cream sundae. Hot fudge? Anybody want to stop by?
You got an hour to go, Carol. Hey, let's get a check on the latest world and national news. Nancy Lyons is in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. 5 Americans who were imprisoned in Iran are on their way home. The U.S. agreed to a prisoner swap that will also return 5 Iranians and give Tehran access to $6 billion of its own oil revenue that the U.S. had frozen through sanctions. Secretary of State Antony Blinken hailed the agreement.
It's very good to be able to say that our fellow citizens are free after enduring something that I think it would be difficult for any of us to imagine, that their families will soon have them back among them, and that in this moment, at least, I have something very joyful to report.
Secretary Blinken says today's release follows months of negotiations. He thanked the leaders of Qatar, Oman, Switzerland, and the UK for helping win the release of the 5 Americans. Iran's president says today's deal will definitely help in building trust. President Biden has a busy week planned with New York his first stop. He's scheduled to address the United Nations General Assembly tomorrow. He'll also hold meetings with several world leaders, including Brazil's president and Israel's prime minister. Then on Thursday, he'll host Ukrainian President Zelensky at the White House. That visit comes as the administration pushes Congress for more funding for that country's fight against Russia. Attorneys for former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark were in court today seeking to have his Georgia election interference case moved to federal court. He's one of 5 defendants in the Fulton County case that have sought that move. Former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows tried but failed to have his case shifted to federal court. The same judge is hearing Clark's case. A rapidly intensifying storm in the Atlantic has developed into a hurricane. The National Hurricane Center in Miami says Nigel is a fast-paced storm that's expected to strengthen into a major hurricane by tomorrow. It poses no immediate threat, though, to land. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Tim and Carol.
If a hurricane is named Nigel, is it nicer?
No, it's more proper.
It sounds like,
It's very formal.
Suede loafers and smoking jacket.
Who knows?
I shouldn't make jokes because hurricanes are serious things.
You guys on your trip?
We came home early because we were a little worried about Lee.
Yeah.
And mostly we thought it was going to miss us, but you never know about storm surges, and they were worried about winds. We actually pulled. We pulled the boat.
There were also a couple days. That was different than the couple days of huge rains that we had at that first week, right? You guys were there for that?
No.
You didn't get
we
bad
didn't
weather?
get that.
Okay.
No, we were
That's
okay.
good.
But we did get some bad weather once we were back. It was just a storm, but
Okay.
you always get a little nervous. Hey, speaking of things that we're kind of tracking, definitely storms, the weather, right? It's like every day. Meantime, we're still looking at the strike, right? The striking writers and actors.
Yeah, we got lots of strikes we're going to be talking about this afternoon.
Good point.
Bill Maher has joined, he said he's going to delay the return of his HBO talk show, Real Time. He's become the latest celebrity to backtrack, this after protests from striking writers and actors. So we should know Bill Maher, he's on HBO, but his show has been on hiatus since May. That's when the Writers Guild of America went on strike. He had planned to restart his show, joining other stars, including Drew Barrymore, Jennifer Hudson as well. They delayed the return of their programs following a backlash over the weekend. Drew Barrymore saying in a post on Instagram yesterday, quote, "I have listened to everyone and I am making the decision to pause the show's premiere until the strike is over."
It's interesting, right? Like all of a sudden you're like, well, maybe we'll bring it back. Well, maybe we won't. Another show, The Talk, scheduled to return today. It has put those plans on hold, according to Paramount Global's CBS, which produces the program. Has brought everything to a halt. There was another story. ABC is going to air an additional 10 Monday night football games because of the writers and actors strikes. I just saw this. This is coming out of AP. This just crossed the Bloomberg.
We should note that Bill Maher made his decision to return to work when it seemed like the dispute between the writers and studios would never end. The writers and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, they do plan to resume talks. That's on Wednesday, September 20th.
kind of interesting. We'll see ultimately how it ends up, right?
I just wonder what it's going to do for content on the streaming services and over the next couple of years.
People might pick up a book.
Maybe.
Listen to an audiobook, perhaps.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I love them. All right, everybody, don't go anywhere. Lots to come in the next 60 minutes of Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg Radio.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
Hi, everyone. Bloomberg Business Week continuing, yes, on this Monday, live from our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming on YouTube and, of course, on Bloomberg Originals. Carol Masser, along with Tim Stenevec.
Hey, we got a great hour coming up here. Yeah, I said we're going to be talking about strikes, not just the writer's strike, but after decades of discontent, GM, Ford, and Stellantis underestimated just how combative union leadership has become. It's in the magazine. We're going to talk all about it.
What, you don't take a meeting with Bill Ford?
I mean, if you're Sean Fain, you don't.
We're going to get into that. And then, full disclosure, someone you know well.
Yeah, Diana Henriquez is going to be joining us. She's got a new book out, Taming the Street, The Old Guard, The New Deal, and FDR's Fight to Regulate American Capitalism. Diana gave me my first job in business journalism. I was her research assistant, one of a couple on The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust.
Pretty cool. I'm curious about what she has to say about today's environment, but I also, what's interesting about her book, about how many things years ago, the era of, we saw markets go up and then markets fall apart.
The Roaring 20s.
The Roaring 20s, the jazz era, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of things that you can kind of put into today's environment. So I'm curious how she thinks about it.
Yeah, the Financial Times calling the book riveting and timely. We're going to talk to her all about that. First up, though, let's get a check on the top business stories in today's trade. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Hi, thank you very much. Turned out to be an up day after all for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. The key takeaway, though, little changed. People gearing up for the Fed's hawkish pause on Wednesday. Right now, today, the S&P was up 3 points to 44.53, a gain of about 0.1%. The Dow today up 6 points, up by less than 0.1%. The NASDAQ Composite Index also little changed, up 2 points to 13,710 on NASDAQ. 10-year yield, 4.30%, with the 2-year 5.05%. Spot gold virtually flat on the day, $19.33 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.8%, 91.48 on WTI. Brent, the global benchmark, closing in on 94.64, up today by about 0.8%. Investors and traders looking ahead to Wednesday's Fed decision, and we will likely be getting more insight into the path of interest rates later for the year and into 2024. Sophie Lund-Yates is equity analyst at Hargreaves Lansdowne.
There's a great deal of resilience still in the consumer, and everybody's just very excited. I think there's also a great deal of this notion that central banks are going to be sticking to the script, and that interest rates are going to be doing exactly what everybody predicts it to be happening. And unfortunately, as we know, that's not necessarily going to be how this plays out. So I do think there's potentially some overexcitement in the markets.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Nikola shares surged 33% today after the company appointed former GM president Mary Chan as its new chief operating officer. Again, recapping, S&P higher, little changed, up 3 points, up by about 0.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Well, now, Lord, Mr. Ford, I just wish that you could see what your simple horseless carriage has become.
We are talking Ford, we're talking General Motors, we're talking Stellantis. It is day 4 of a strike by the United Auto Workers, and as Bloomberg's Keith Naughton reports, the walkout led by UAW President Sean Fain at 3 GM, Ford Motor, and Stellantis factories is no ordinary labor versus industry clash.
That's right. The story is among our most read on the Bloomberg and is today's Bloomberg Big Take. With more on how we got here and where we're going, let's go to Keith Naughton, who's Bloomberg News auto reporter. He joins us on Zoom in Detroit. You can read Keith's story and more from the Bloomberg Big Take on the Bloomberg terminal and, of course, at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Also here with us, the editor of Bloomberg Business Week, Joel Weber. He's with us in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. They call him Hurricane Fain.
Yeah. He brought it. We don't see hurricanes in Detroit often, but this is what it looks like.
He's different than other UAW leaders.
And has been extremely strategic in how they've brought this strike to bear. Right, Keith Nutton?
Yeah, and I just want to credit my co-author, David Welch, for coining the term Hurricane Fain. I think you might want to get trademarked. But yes, Sean Fain is very unconventional, starting with standing up Bill Ford, the great-grandson of Henry Ford, who is the executive chairman of the company. He came down last week to personally make Ford's fourth proposal. This one had a 20% raise. Ford said it was the best one they ever offered the union, and Sean was a no-show.
Who does that? Obviously, Sean Fain does. But, I mean, what is it in his character that makes someone do that, or does he feel so confident about his position, bargaining position?
It's a new level of brinksmanship in auto contract talks anyway, because he did that on Wednesday, and then the very next day, on Thursday morning, he stood up GM Chairman Mary Barra. So
this is how you negotiate.
Yes, he feels like if he doesn't show, maybe that'll goad them into making a better offer.
So what does next steps here look like for Mr. Fain?
So we just put out a story, a union source telling us this afternoon that the union still has not received a counter proposal from any of the three companies since the union made its counter proposal on the 14th, last Thursday, the day just before the strike began. So, so what we're waiting for is, I guess, more, fully fleshed out proposals from the automakers, which means they're going to have to come up with something sweeter than they're offering so far, because the union has rejected everything they've offered. Sean Fain yesterday called it no go.
So take a step back. I kind of joked with you, like, who does that? But who is this guy that obviously is operating very differently from other heads of the UAW?
Yeah, I mean, he's a true believer. The way he came up was as a reformer. You might recall the UAW was rocked by scandal. Its two previous presidents went to prison because they were misappropriating union funds to fund their lavish lifestyles. So he came in as a reformer to fund their lavish lifestyles. So he came in as a reformer and